A boy was born on a world that didn't remember peace, not because peace had left, but because it had never arrived. His name was Hondo, and by the time he could walk, war had already passed over his village. Not like a storm, but like a predator. What it didn't kill, it scattered. What it scattered, it forgot. This is the story of Hondo Ohnaka, the pirate king of Florum, the fool who outlived empires. But before the fame, before the gang, before the ships and the lies, there was only a boy, and he was hungry. The Outer Rim didn't notice new life. Not in the chaos of the Clone Wars, not in the centuries before it. Florum had always been a world left behind, buried under the shadows of stronger systems, controlled by warlords, traded between slavers, scarred by pirates. The Republic didn't govern it, the Jedi didn't guard it, and the Sith only passed through to burn something down. No one kept track of orphans on Florum, especially when those orphans came from nowhere. Hondo's parents were never recorded, their names lost, their tribe, if there ever was one, erased. But survivors remember a single wrecked transport ship, civilian, small and slow, crashing during a pirate raid over the equator line. They say a baby was pulled from the wreckage, alone, screaming, still clinging to the sleeve of a burnt corpse that might have once been his mother. No one offered to help, but someone took him, not out of kindness, out of opportunity. The Nikto raiders who ruled that sector had no use for infants, but children were useful. Children grew, children obeyed, children could be shaped. So he was taken in, not adopted, owned. He was one of dozens, dirty, nameless, fed just enough to stay alive, but never enough to feel safe. They were trained not to fight, but to obey, trained not to speak, but to steal. The punishment for failure wasn't correction, it was removal. Hondo learned quickly. He watched the older ones disappear, those who hesitated, those who talked back, those who couldn't lie convincingly when the raid leaders questioned them. He didn't cry when they vanished. He didn't ask where they went. He just smiled. A wide, harmless grin that made him look smaller than he was. A grin that made him seem slower, dumber, easier to ignore. But he watched, every day. And he remembered. The Nikto didn't know what they were creating. They thought they were training a tool. They were building a survivor. By the time Hondo was 10, he could pick a lock blindfolded. He could slip through a ventilation shaft no wider than a stormtrooper's helmet. He could hotwire a land speeder using nothing but stripped wire and a stolen vibro knife. But more than anything, he could lie. He lied to the guards. He lied to his crew. He lied to the slavers who bought his silence. And he lied to himself that he was happy, that this was life, that there had never been anything else. It was easier that way, easier to smile, easier to laugh too loudly, easier to play the fool, because fools didn't get executed. Fools weren't threats. Fools survived. By 13, they stopped calling him the boy. They called him Hondo, like he was one of them, but he never was. He wasn't Nikto. He wasn't clan. He wasn't family. He was something else. Something forming behind the mask. Not a pirate yet, but no longer a child. He was something waiting to happen, and soon he would. Florum did not have seasons. It had eras of violence. The sky shifted from dust to fire and back again. The ground cracked beneath ancient shipwrecks, and the winds carried the sound of engines that had never landed peacefully. It was not a place where things grew. It was a place where things crashed, and then rusted. By the time Hondo Ohnaka was 15, he understood that this world was not broken. It had never been whole. There were no cities, no governments, only strongholds, hidden depots, and scattered pirate camps fighting for whatever was left. If Coruscant was the heart of the Republic, Florum was its forgotten limb, and in that limb, parasites thrived. The Nikto raiders who had once ruled the airfields were gone now, burned out by rival gangs with better ships, their banners reduced to ash, their bones picked clean in skirmishes no one remembered. Hondo didn't mourn them. When the smoke cleared, he wasn't hiding. He was waiting. Other scavengers came to loot what was left. Speeders, droids, weapon caches buried beneath old sand. Hondo watched them all. He didn't fire first. He didn't lead a charge. He offered something more valuable. A map, a shortcut, a lie. And when they took the bait, they never returned. Piece by piece, Hondo began to build something. Not a home, not yet, but a reputation. He knew how to navigate the wreck fields. He knew which bunkers still had power. He knew how to talk to the surviving droids, even the ones whose memory cores were corrupted by decades of violence. He made himself useful, and useful things were allowed to live. That's what saved him when the Weekay came. They were different from the Nikto. Less tribal, more organized. Fewer grunts, more captains. They didn't just raid, they controlled. Their ships were old, but fast. Their weapons were dirty, but brutal. And their leader, a one-eyed brute named Kravex, didn't care who had ruled Florum before. He only cared who could serve him now. Hondo didn't fight them, he entertained them. He brought them power cells, black market spice, stolen speeder bikes, always with a grin, always with a story, always with more to offer. The Weekay laughed. They mocked his voice, his face, his cowardice, but they kept him around. And eventually, Kravex gave him a job. Not a real one. Not at first. He was assigned to clean ship hulls, recharge fuel lines, run errands too boring or too dangerous for anyone else. It was humiliating work. Hondo did it with pride, because every ship he cleaned was a map. Every cargo hold was a code. Every overheard insult was information. And every pilot who underestimated him was one more person who wouldn't see it coming. The Weekay crew didn't notice when things began to shift. Not at first. Their credits started going missing. Their blasters went offline. Their droids stopped responding. And Hondo just smiled wider. It wasn't sabotage. Not directly. He was smarter than that. He simply made himself the one person who could fix things. Quietly. Quickly. With a joke, a shrug, and a trick up his sleeve. Oh, they stopped calling him names. They started calling him Captain. Kravex didn't laugh when that title was spoken. He didn't object either, because by then, Hondo wasn't cleaning the ships. He was flying them. He had memorized the controls, studied the jump routes, bribed the engineers, stolen fuel from other gangs, and when the time came to lead his first raid, he didn't hesitate. He brought back twice the loot, half the casualties, and all the credit. The crew cheered. Kravex watched in silence. And Florum remained lawless. But now it had a new name rising from the dust, one that would echo across the stars. He didn't learn from books. He learned from what the dying said with their last breath. There was no academy on Florum, no formal training, just pain, and the ability to watch it happen without blinking. In a galaxy obsessed with Jedi temples and Sith archives, Hondo's education came from the floor of a pirate ship. And it started with a betrayal. Kravex, the Weekay captain who had once tolerated Hondo, had begun to feel the shift. He didn't understand how his crew now looked to the young upstart for orders. He didn't understand how raids had become smoother, faster, more profitable, but also quieter, more precise. Because Hondo didn't fight for territory, he fought for favor. Every time someone disobeyed Kravex, Hondo was there to resolve it, calm them down, offer a better plan. It looked like loyalty. It felt like ambition. Kravex made his move during a cargo run near the ion drift fields, a dead zone of electromagnetic interference and scattered starship remains. He waited until the signal vanished from the other ships. Then he struck. No speech, no warning, just a vibroblade aimed at Hondo's throat. But Hondo had already seen it coming, not because of the blade, but because of the silence. Kravex never spoke when he was unsure, and he had been very, very quiet lately. The fight was fast, dirty, unworthy of stories. It ended with Kravex choking on his own blood, begging in a voice no one recognized. Hondo didn't finish him with anger. He finished him with necessity, and he didn't look away. That was the first time the crew truly feared him. He didn't become captain by shouting. He became captain because no one else wanted to challenge him. After that, they painted his name on the hull of their flagship, not with credits or contracts, but with the same red that soaked the floor. HN-01. Ohnaka's blade. It wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a symbol. And Hondo was becoming one too. His leadership was strange. He didn't punish failure with pain. He punished it with humiliation. If someone stole from the crew, he made them explain themselves, publicly, in front of all, while sitting in the smallest escape pod on the ship. If someone disobeyed orders, he let them live, but took their boots, and every time he smiled. It confused the others. It unsettled them. But it worked, because fear lasts only so long. But embarrassment, that stays. Soon, other small crews began joining them, not out of loyalty, but because Hondo let them keep a larger cut. He gave them reasons to follow him, reasons they hadn't heard before from a pirate leader. No promises of honor, no dreams of conquest. Just survival, credits, and a good story at the end. Still, Hondo wasn't blind, and he knew trust was dangerous. He had trusted once, and that trust had almost killed him. So he studied his new followers, every gesture, every eye movement. He remembered who drank too early before a job, who whispered after lights out, who asked questions that didn't match their rank. He didn't confront them. He waited. Then one night, during a hyperspace jump, a traitor tried to disable the nav system and reroute the ship back to their old employer. The crew never saw the body. But the next morning, Hondo had added a new line to his usual welcome speech. Join my crew, keep your share. Try to steal it, I keep your tongue. He laughed when he said it. So did everyone else. But no one ever tested him again. These were the lessons Florum gave. They weren't written in stone. They were written in blood. And Hondo never forgot any of them. By the time the galaxy first learned his name, Hondo Ohnaka had already learned how to disappear. Not physically, emotionally. He laughed louder than anyone else in the room. He exaggerated his fear, his greed, his foolishness. He told the same jokes again and again until others stopped listening closely. That was the point. Because while they laughed, he measured distances. While they mocked him, he memorized escape routes. And while they believed he was harmless, he made decisions that decided who lived. The crew thought his humor was weakness. They never realized it was armor. Hondo had seen what seriousness did to men like Kravex. It hardened them, isolated them, made them predictable. Strong leaders became lonely leaders, and lonely leaders died first. So Hondo became something else. A pirate who looked afraid, a captain who sounded unsure, a fool who somehow always survived. It allowed him to move freely, to speak to rivals without triggering suspicion, to negotiate with smugglers who would never trust a hardened warlord. When danger approached, it never felt threatened by him. That was his greatest weapon. On Florum, perception was reality. If others believed you were weak, they underestimated you. If they believed you were mad, they avoided provoking you. And if they believed you were stupid, they told you everything. Hondo listened. He listened when rival captains complained about fuel shortages. He listened when mercenaries bragged about upcoming raids. He listened when separatist agents passed through the Outer Rim, offering credits for silence. The Clone Wars were beginning to stir beyond Florum's sky, and not yet fully ignited, but close enough that tremors could be felt even here. Trade routes tightened, patrols increased, and suddenly, pirates were no longer just thieves. They were assets. Hondo understood this before anyone else. He didn't choose a side. He chose opportunity. He sold information once, then twice, then carefully. Never enough to expose himself. Never enough to draw attention from Jedi or generals. Always just enough to stay profitable. And still, he laughed. The laugh became famous, high-pitched, annoying, constant. People remembered it more than his name. That suited him fine. At night, when the ships powered down and Florum's storms rolled across the plains, Hondo often sat alone in the cockpit, not commanding, not celebrating, just staring at the stars. He didn't think of his parents. Not anymore. He thought of hunger, not the kind that twisted the stomach, but the kind that never left the mind. The fear that one day the credits would run dry. The fear that laughter would fail. The fear that the galaxy would finally notice him. Because being seen meant being hunted. So he planned. Always forward, always sideways, never straight. He kept escape ships ready. Hidden caches buried across Florum. Codes that only he knew. Deals that contradicted each other by design. If one side betrayed him, another would save him. If everyone betrayed him, he would already be gone. This was not paranoia. This was memory. The child beneath the wreckage still lived inside him, silent, watching, waiting for the moment everything collapsed again. And he knew it would. Because in the galaxy, nothing built on chaos ever lasted forever. As the Clone Wars edged closer, as Jedi and Sith shadows stretched toward the Outer Rim, Hondo Ohnaka smiled wider. Not because he was happy, but because he was ready. And soon, the galaxy would learn his name, not as a survivor, but as a pirate king. They didn't follow him because he was strong. They followed him because they believed he was lucky. It began slowly. A whisper, a rumor, a name passed between crews in the Outer Rim. Ohnaka, the one who survived Krevex, the one who smiled before a kill, the one who returned with credits when others came back in pieces. He had no planet, no fleet, no syndicate behind him, but somehow they came, not all at once, and not with loyalty. The first few were broken captains, Weequay, Nikto, a half-mad Klatwinian who had burned through 3 crews in one cycle. They weren't looking for leadership. They were looking for work, for safety, for someone else to make the next decision. Hondo made those decisions with a drink in hand and a joke on his lips. But each choice was calculated. Each offer was weighed. He never promised safety, he promised profit, and that was enough. The Outer Rim had no use for oaths. It respected results, and Hondo gave them that. Every raid planned with precision, every retreat disguised as a victory, every target chosen not for glory, but for vulnerability, Republic convoys, small-time hut shipments, even separatist supply chains when the timing was right. He didn't care who lost, only that his crew gained. But with each win came weight, more credits, more mouths, more expectations, and more eyes. Success attracts predators. Rival gangs began to notice the pattern. Ships marked with Ohnaka's name were growing in number. His territory, though unofficial, had started to form. It wasn't drawn on any map, but it was understood in the stars. From the Breach Nebula to the Cathal Rift, pilots began saying the same thing. Don't cross that route. Ohnaka runs it now. But Hondo never claimed it. He let the myth build itself. He didn't establish a capital. He didn't declare a pirate nation. He did something stranger, something no one expected. He kept moving, always changing the rendezvous points, always shifting the storage hubs. Even his own crew didn't know where he'd be next until they received the signal. It made him unpredictable. It made him untouchable. And it made him alone. Even among his own people, he remained distant. Present, yes. Loud, visible, laughing at their jokes. But never vulnerable, never still. He drank with them, danced with them, toasted their kills. But no one ever saw him sleep. He had grown up knowing that stillness invites betrayal. So he never allowed himself to settle. And yet, something was building. The scattered ships, the disloyal crews, the clashing cultures and voices. Somehow, under his hand, they were beginning to act as one. It wasn't an army. It was something worse. A gang with no code, no name, no center. Until a day came when a captain, drunk, bruised, and desperate to impress, raised a stolen flag above his ship. Not the Republic's, not the Separatists', but a new symbol, painted fast, ugly, unplanned. A stylized skull, laughing, with one word beneath it. Ohnaka. Hondo had not ordered it. He had not approved it. But when he saw it, he didn't take it down. He let it fly. And the next raid, 3 more ships flew the same mark. By the end of the cycle, it was 10. It had begun. He didn't build a nation. He built a shadow. And soon, even the huts would learn to fear it. Zhu's power does not announce itself. It tests. And the first test came without warning. A Nikto warband, remnants of an older pirate clan, struck one of Hondo's outer supply convoys near the Poln major trade corridor. They didn't take much. A few crates, 2 prisoners. But the message was clear. You are growing, and growth invites challenge. The crew waited for Hondo to respond with anger, with threats, with spectacle. He did neither. Instead, he laughed, a soft laugh, almost tired. Then he ordered the ships to scatter. It confused everyone. Some believed he was afraid. Others whispered that the rumors were wrong, that Ohnaka was clever but weak when tested. Hondo heard the whispers. He allowed them. Because fear earned through chaos fades fast. Fear earned through memory lasts. 3 days later, one of the captured pirates returned. Only one. He arrived drifting in a damaged pod, barely conscious, his armor scorched black. He said nothing when pulled aboard. He didn't need to. His silence spoke clearly enough. The Nikto warband was gone, not destroyed in battle, erased. Hondo had waited until they celebrated their raid, until their defenses fell, until they believed the danger had passed. Then he struck with half the crew he actually commanded, the rest hidden in the dark beyond sensor range. There were no speeches, no surrender, just fire. When it was done, Hondo ordered the prisoners released. Not all of them. 2 were left behind on the wreckage, alive, but broken, so others would find them. Because terror travels faster than ships. The message reached every pirate lane within weeks. You could steal from Ohnaka once. You would never steal twice. From that moment on, loyalty had a price, and that price was blood. Not always spilled, but always remembered. Hondo never demanded devotion. He demanded obedience. He allowed disagreement. He allowed greed. He did not allow betrayal. To those who followed him, he offered protection. To those who crossed him, he offered survival. Barely. The crew began to change. Men who once argued now waited for orders. Captains who once boasted now asked permission. Even rivals approached him not with weapons, but with proposals. He listened to all of them. Sometimes he accepted. Sometimes he smiled and refused. And sometimes he invited them to drink. Those meetings rarely ended well. Still, he was careful. Always careful. He never killed without reason, never punished without witnesses. Violence to him was not emotion. It was communication. In a language Florum understood. As the Clone Wars spread, so did his influence. Republic patrols tightened major routes, forcing smugglers and pirates into narrower lanes. Those lanes belonged to Hondo now, not because he claimed them, but because he protected them. For a cut. Pilots who paid passed safely. Those who didn't vanished into ion storms and unmarked graves. Soon, even neutral traders spoke his name quietly. Not with hatred, not with admiration, with caution. The Ohnaka gang was no longer a rumor. It was a system, and systems demand order. Hondo felt it growing heavier on his shoulders. The decisions came faster, the consequences deeper. Every death rippled outward. Every mercy was tested. At night, he still sat alone in the cockpit, still watched the stars, still listened for the sound of betrayal in the hum of the engines. But now, the silence felt different. Not empty, expectant. Because he had crossed a line he could never step back from. He was no longer surviving chaos. He was shaping it. Every empire needs rules, even the ones built by thieves. Hondo Ohnaka had never been a student of politics. He didn't trust governments, and he didn't quote old teachings. But he understood something deeper, something he had seen from the ground up. That without a code, even chaos would devour itself. His crew had grown too large, too diverse, too dangerous. Weekay, Nikto, Deveronians, humans, former mercenaries, ex-slaves, disgraced soldiers, all orbiting one central figure, a pirate who smiled too much and trusted no one. And yet, they listened to him, because somehow the credits kept coming. But credits were not enough, not anymore. Without structure, envy would rot the inside. Fear would rule the outside. Rivals would notice the cracks before the crew did. So Hondo invented something rare in pirate culture, an agreement. It wasn't written on parchment. There was no council, no vote, just a night in the Florum wind, a broken-down landing field. And the gang gathered beneath the hull of the old Weequay flagship. He stood on the wing, cloak blowing in the dust, drink in one hand, blaster in the other. And he told a story, not of himself, but of a mythical pirate, nameless, faceless, always one step ahead. The crew listened, confused, until Hondo ended it with a sentence that became legend. There is no honor among thieves, but there is protocol. And that was the beginning. The next day, orders changed. Shares were counted publicly. Captains were rotated. And crew members could call for judgment, not justice, but arbitration. If someone broke a deal, they didn't lose their life. They lost their cut. If someone betrayed the crew, they didn't get executed immediately. They got voted off the ship, left stranded with a blaster and one chance to survive. It was cruel, but it was fair. Fairness, in pirate terms, was a myth, but myths inspire. Other gangs took notice. Some mocked it, others copied it, and Hondo watched both with amusement. Because the rules weren't about morality, they were about control. His enemies expected him to rule through fear. They were prepared for it. But this, a pirate code enforced by profit, embarrassment, and democratic exile, it made him unpredictable, and unpredictable men are difficult to kill. Still, the pressure grew. The Ohnaka gang was no longer a loose collection of ships. It was a force. It had raid routes, hidden stations, slicer teams, and a growing network of bribed officials across nearby systems. The Republic began to list them in intelligence briefings. The Separatists started sending agents to negotiate. And the Hutts watched. All of it stemmed from the same lie. That Hondo was in control. Because in truth, he was improvising every day, adjusting to personalities, guessing at intentions, bribing just enough to avoid mutiny, punishing just enough to seem ruthless. There was no grand plan, only instinct, only reaction. But the code gave the illusion of stability. An illusion in the hands of a performer becomes reality. He continued to host meetings as shows. He walked into tense confrontations with open arms. He made ridiculous demands and then surprised everyone by delivering. By the time rivals realized how much ground he had gained, it was too late. He had created something the Outer Rim hadn't seen before. A pirate order built not on ideology, but efficiency. And beneath it all, one man, one lie. A captain who claimed he was nothing more than a fool, but who somehow never lost. There was no ceremony, no declaration, just a symbol. One rusted banner hung from the side of a stolen ship, faded paint, a laughing skull. A joke, really. Something a drunk crewmate had thrown together in celebration of a successful raid. But it caught on. The skull became a mark, and the mark became a warning. Merchant ships began changing course when they saw it. Smaller pirate bands began copying it, hoping to be mistaken for something bigger. And those who didn't soon wished they had. Because the Ohnaka gang had stopped being a name. It was now a shadow. You couldn't track them. You couldn't predict them. And you couldn't bribe them because every deal had already been made 3 layers deep. And behind all of it was a smile. Hondo Ohnaka remained a contradiction. His crew joked about his luck. His enemies cursed his name. Officials filed reports on him, but none matched. His accent, his age, even his origin changed depending on who told the story. And that too was intentional. Because myths don't get caught. Myths don't get held accountable. They survive. And Hondo was surviving better than ever. He controlled more than just raids now. He had informants in Outer Rim customs posts. He had docking rights in shadow ports no one spoke about. He had slicers who could erase ship records before they were even written. But more than anything, he had time. The Clone Wars were coming. The galaxy was dividing. Sides were forming. Jedi and Sith, Republic and Separatists, planets and systems, all caught in a tide too large to escape. But Hondo had no side. He had leverage. That made him dangerous in a way no army could match. Because when both factions are at war, they stop looking sideways. And that's where he lived, in the spaces between. His raids became surgical. His profits multiplied. And with each passing cycle, more captains joined him. Not out of fear, but preference. They wanted to follow Hondo. Not because he was the strongest, but because he didn't lie about what he was. He didn't claim justice. He didn't preach power. He offered credits, freedom, a chance to live just a little longer. And when you live in the Outer Rim, That's all most ever wanted. The Ohnaka gang became an institution. Ships bore its markings. Stories followed its movements. And soon, even the Jedi began to hear whispers of the pirate who smiled too much and lost too little. But with legacy comes danger. Hondo knew it, felt it, carried it like a blade beneath his cloak. Because the higher you rise, the clearer your silhouette becomes. He began doubling his countermeasures, triple-checking every crew addition, removing captains who got too ambitious, replacing lieutenants who asked the wrong questions. He smiled the whole time. He always smiled. Because the legacy wasn't about laughter, it was about memory. The boy beneath the wreckage hadn't vanished. He was still there, watching, listening, waiting for it all to fall apart again. But this time, he would fall with a crown. And when that moment came, when the Empire rose and the galaxy shifted again, Hondo would be ready to adapt, to survive, to fade if needed. Because this wasn't the story of a pirate who ruled. It was the story of a pirate who endured. And as the Clone Wars crept ever closer, the galaxy would soon come face to face with the name it had tried to laugh away. Ohnaka. Some captures are planned with precision, others are delivered by accident. Count Dooku, the fallen Jedi, leader of the Separatist Alliance, apprenticed to Darth Sidious, was not meant to be caught. He was meant to command, to manipulate, to disappear when threatened. But on the outer rim world of Vancor, even legends can fall from the sky. His ship, crippled by a Republic assault, crash-landed in the wild jungles. No escort, no signal, no allies. Just the Sith. Alone. It should have ended there, with his body burned or his presence lost in the foliage. But fate, or mischief, placed another ship nearby. A pirate vessel, lightly armed, patrolling for salvage. It belonged to Hondo Ohnaka, and in that moment, the galaxy blinked. No alarms, no armies, no master plan. Just one pirate captain and the most dangerous man in the war, face to face in the wreckage. Hondo didn't draw his blaster. He smiled. He offered assistance, supplies, even comfort. He called Dooku, Your Highness. He spoke like an old friend, like a man who had just found fortune, not a threat. Dooku was cautious, but injured. His pride wounded deeper than his flesh. He accepted the help. He didn't notice the sedatives in the wine. By the time his mind cleared, he was in chains, and Hondo Ohnaka was negotiating with both sides of the war. He sent a message to Coruscant, calm, respectful, even courteous. Count Dooku is in my custody, safe, unharmed, and available for a reasonable price. He offered no threats, no ultimatums. He didn't gloat. He simply presented facts. The Jedi Council was skeptical, the Chancellor even more so. But intelligence confirmed the impossible. Dooku had vanished, and the only signal coming from Vancor was Hondo's. It was a move no pirate should have survived. No warlord would have dared. The Sith had long memories. The Republic had no tolerance for manipulation. But Hondo had already stepped past that line. He knew he couldn't keep Dooku. He didn't need to. He just needed the credit, the weight, the legacy of the act. Because once you've caged a Sith Lord, even for a moment, your name no longer echoes in cantinas. It echoes in war rooms, and that's what he wanted. Not just credits, reputation. Even as Dooku sat in the dark, silent and watching, Hondo never blinked. He made sure the chains were real, the guards alert, the sedatives timed. He didn't mock him. He respected the danger, but he didn't fear it. Because Hondo believed something that most in the galaxy didn't. that even monsters can bleed, and more importantly, they can be sold. His crew was less sure. Whispers passed between hallways. Some feared Jedi retaliation. Others feared Sith revenge. One mistake, they said, and they'd all be dead. But Hondo dismissed their concerns with the same old grin. If the Jedi kill us, we die noble. If Dooku kills us, we die interesting. Either way, we die remembered. And that, to him, was enough. He ordered the ship refueled, the engines prepped, escape routes mapped, just in case. And then he waited. Because in the Outer Rim, chaos isn't feared, it's expected. And for the first time, Hondo was no longer reacting to it. He was creating it. They arrived with caution. 2 Jedi, a Padawan, 1 mission, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker, and Ahsoka Tano. Sent not to fight, but to negotiate, because Count Dooku was in chains, and the man holding them wasn't a warlord, a general, or a Sith. He was a pirate, and Hondo Ohnaka welcomed them with open arms. The meeting took place inside his stronghold on Florum. The chambers were dim, the air thick with spice fumes and the hum of droid sentries. Every door had at least 2 guards. Every guard wore a smile they didn't mean. But Hondo was different. He greeted the Jedi with warmth, charm, and a vintage bottle of Corellian wine he claimed had once belonged to a senator. He complimented Ahsoka's hair. He praised Obi-Wan's robes. And he addressed Anakin with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. There were no threats. No blasters drawn. Only a price. 10 million credits. Not a ransom. A transaction. Hondo never once called Dooku a prisoner. He used words like guest, visitor, and temporary inconvenience. The Jedi remained cautious. They knew this man. They had fought beside him once. Barely. But his loyalty was thin and his patience thinner. Obi-Wan tried diplomacy. Calm, firm, distant. Anakin offered warnings. Hondo laughed. And Ahsoka stayed quiet, eyes never leaving the shadows. Dooku said nothing. From his cell below, he watched everything. He knew the Jedi would hesitate. He counted on it. But what unnerved him wasn't their presence. It was Hondo, because Count Dooku had faced Mandalorians. He had survived Sith betrayal. He had even stood before Yoda and walked away. But never had he been outplayed by a man with no force, no title, and no army. And that was what Hondo had done. He had made himself the center of the galaxy, if only for a moment. Still, danger followed closely. Hondo's own men were growing restless. Some wanted to release Dooku. Others wanted to sell him to the separatists instead. Whispers grew sharper. A few guards began skipping shifts. One cell lock was left open for just a second too long. And in that second, Dooku moved. He struck fast, disabling 2 guards, slipping past surveillance, reaching the inner corridors before the alarms even sounded. But Hondo was waiting, not with blasters, with offers. He didn't want to fight. He wanted control. So he met Dooku in the hallway. No weapons, just words, and offered him the same deal he had given the Jedi. Buy your freedom. Dooku refused. He said nothing, but his silence was venom. A Sith did not buy freedom. A Sith took it, but not today. Hondo had planned for this. Hidden ray shields, sedative gas, magnetic locks, and once again, the Count was in chains. The Jedi were informed. The deal was still alive, but now, so was suspicion. Why was Dooku still alive? Why hadn't Hondo turned him over already? Why delay? The truth was simple. Hondo wanted more. Not just credits. Not just names. He wanted influence. Because in the Clone Wars, knowledge was more valuable than weapons. And right now, Hondo had knowledge. of Jedi movements, of separatist supply routes, of weaknesses, all stored in the man in his basement. But even he knew, the longer you hold a Sith, the closer you are to death. So the countdown had begun, not to a sail, but to a collapse. And in the shadows of that countdown, the pirate played both sides. Betrayal never arrives loudly. It moves in whispers, in glances held too long, in guards who suddenly avoid eye contact, in silence where laughter used to live. Hondo felt it before he saw it. The crew was changing. The presence of Count Dooku had infected them, not with fear, but temptation. Every pirate aboard knew the truth. One prisoner, one decision, and they would never need to raid again. Some dreamed of selling Dooku to the separatists. Others believed the Sith would reward loyalty with power. A few simply wanted the credits and a ship of their own. Hondo had built his gang on profit. Now profit was turning on him. He tightened security, rotated guards, slept less, smiled more, but smiles could not stop greed. The first attempt came during a shift change. 2 sentries rerouted power from the cell corridor. A third disabled the cameras. It was clean, professional, too professional. Hondo arrived before the door opened. He didn't shout. He didn't punish. He asked a question. Who promised you something I could not? No one answered. So he let them go. That frightened the rest far more than executions ever could, because mercy in moments like that felt unnatural. The second attempt came from within his inner circle, a captain he had trusted since the early raids, someone who had bled beside him, someone who had once sworn loyalty under the Laughing Skull. This time, Hondo didn't intervene. He watched. He let the traitor reach Dooku's cell. Let him whisper deals of escape and revenge. Let him dream of reward. And when the cell door opened, Dooku killed him. Not out of loyalty, not out of rage, out of instruction. Because Sith do not share power. The body was found at dawn, and with it, the truth became unavoidable. Hondo no longer controlled the situation. The Sith was shaping events from inside a cage. Crew members stopped sleeping. Arguments broke out over nothing. Blasters were kept closer to the hand. Every glance felt like a calculation. This was the cost of power too great for pirates. Hondo had wanted influence. Instead, he had invited something ancient and patient into his house. He met with Obi-Wan again, this time privately. The Jedi could feel it too, the disturbance, the tension humming through the stronghold like a living thing. Anakin grew restless. Ahsoka sensed fear masked as greed. Obi-Wan warned him, "You cannot hold him much longer." Hondo agreed, not with words, but with exhaustion. For the first time since his childhood, he felt the old hunger again, not for credits, not for power, for safety. That night, he prepared to end it. The exchange was scheduled, Republic credits ready, Jedi transport en route, Dooku bound and monitored. Everything precise, everything too late. The final betrayal came not from greed, but panic. A group of pirates attempted to kill Dooku outright, believing his death would erase the danger. They stormed the cell with thermal charges and wild courage. They never reached him. Dooku tore through them like smoke and lightning. When the alarms screamed, the stronghold was already lost. Hondo watched from the command deck as his gang collapsed into chaos. Blaster fire echoing through corridors he had built, screams filling rooms once loud with laughter. This was not rebellion. This was unraveling. He didn't try to stop Dooku. He knew better. Instead, he fled. Not in cowardice, but in understanding. Some forces cannot be owned. Some power poisons everything around it. And as the pirate ship scattered into the night, Hondo Ohnaka realized something quietly devastating. He had built an empire strong enough to capture a Sith, but not strong enough to survive one. Dooku was gone. No trail, no message, no revenge, yet. He vanished as quietly as he had come, and left Hondo's world in pieces. The stronghold on Florum was half burned. Entire wings collapsed. Storage bays emptied by deserters. Droids dismembered, banners torn. The laughing skull, that once proud symbol, now smeared across blood-stained walls. And the crew, what was left of it, didn't meet his eyes. They expected punishment. But Hondo said nothing. He walked the halls alone, boots soft against scorched metal, hands folded, face unreadable. There were no speeches, no executions, no commands, because the damage had already been done. It wasn't the destruction of a base. It was the unraveling of a myth. He had tried to control something too large, too volatile. He had played with Sith fire, thinking he could profit without being burned. And now everything smelled of ash. The Republic refused to pay. The Jedi offered apologies, not credits. Dooku's escape made the transaction void. Hondo had risked everything for leverage, and ended with nothing. Just stories and scars. In the weeks that followed, other pirate crews turned away. Some mocked him, others feared him. A few still honored him, but not many. He didn't chase them. He didn't beg. He let them go. Because power, real power, demands upkeep, and Hondo no longer had the strength to pay for it. The stronghold was sealed. Supply chains rerouted, old contacts burned. What remained of the Ohnaka gang splintered into cells, quiet, cautious, loyal only to survival. Hondo took a smaller ship. He called it Fortune and Folly. Not as a joke, as a confession. He traveled alone for a time, silent runs through forgotten systems. No raids, no deals. Just drifting, listening to the stars. In cantinas, they still spoke his name. The pirate who captured Count Dooku. The madman who tricked the Sith. The fool who lost it all. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between. He didn't lose it all, but he lost enough. And what remained was different, sharper, quieter, hungrier. He stopped trusting easily. He stopped building loudly. No more banners, no more bases, just movement. The galaxy was shifting again, the war deepening, lines being drawn in blood and steel. Hondo no longer stood between those lines. He slipped beneath them. He was still dangerous, still clever, still unpredictable. But now he understood the cost. Because power is not a treasure. It is a debt. Every name you make echoes louder. Every legend you build attracts fire. And every time you gamble with giants, you owe something you may not be able to repay. Hondo Ohnaka survived. But survival is not the same as victory. He no longer smiled as wide. He no longer drank as deep. But he watched and remembered and waited for the next chance, the next mark, the next move, because even broken crowns can still draw attention. And in the dark corners of the galaxy, a pirate who once caged a Sith, that's a man worth fearing, or hiring, or both. The war hadn't ended. It had only changed shape. Count Dooku was gone, but the Clone Wars kept burning. And somehow, Hondo Ohnaka was still in the middle. He didn't plan it that way. He never truly planned anything that far ahead. But survival makes its own decisions. And when the galaxy turns to ash, even pirates can become useful. The Republic needed roots. The Separatists needed silence. And Hondo needed neither. He needed access. So when the Jedi came again, not with blasters drawn, but with requests in hand, Hondo smiled. This time, it wasn't about Dooku. It was about fuel. Jedi cruisers had been damaged, their hyperdrives strained from pursuit. The Florum system was the only nearby location with enough coaxium refinement to make repairs possible. And the only refinery still standing belonged to Hondo. He could have said no, but he didn't. He welcomed Obi-Wan Kenobi with open arms, as if they were old friends reunited. He offered drinks, shelter, even spare parts. No demands, no games, just cooperation. The Jedi hesitated, not because they feared a trap, but because they knew Hondo, and he knew them. There was a comfort in it now, a familiarity born of mutual betrayal. They had faced each other, outwitted each other, survived each other. That counted for something. Hondo didn't admire Jedi ideals, but he respected their consistency. Obi-Wan spoke with clarity, Anakin with fire, Ahsoka with questions. All three had changed since Vancor. So had Hondo, but none of them acknowledged it. Instead, they sat at a shared table and pretended they were still on opposite sides. The Republic offered payment. Hondo negotiated terms. Droids were dispatched to the refinery, supplies transferred, crews assigned, everything professional, everything clean. But behind every smile, every deal, every toast to peace, the same question lingered. Who would betray who first? Because Jedi did not trust pirates, and pirates didn't believe in friendship. Yet somehow the operation held. For 6 days, they worked side by side. Jedi soldiers camped alongside Hondo's mercenaries. Troopers shared fire pits with smugglers. Ahsoka repaired damaged engines while Hondo instructed his men to stay quiet and observe, because he was always watching, not with suspicion, with curiosity. What did the Jedi want from him now? And why hadn't they tried to arrest him? The truth was simple. War makes strange allies, and Hondo knew how to be useful. He gave the Republic what it needed: fuel, parts, access to hidden jump coordinates, in exchange for peace. Temporary, of course. Always temporary. But in a galaxy where peace lasted seconds, that was enough. Even Obi-Wan, usually guarded, admitted as much. "You're not what I expected, Ohnaka." Hondo only smiled. "That's why I'm still alive, my friend." They weren't friends. Not truly. But they weren't enemies anymore either. And in that thin space between alliance and deception, Hondo thrived. He stored everything: Republic codes, Jedi travel logs, clone trooper behavior. Every conversation was filed away in his mind, not for revenge, but for leverage. Because leverage was currency. And trust. Trust was the most expensive thing in the galaxy. Hondo had earned just enough to be welcomed, and just enough to disappear when needed. He didn't serve the Republic. He didn't aid the Separatists. He served opportunity, and in the fires of the Clone Wars, opportunity burned brightest near the Jedi. They fought together more than once, but never on the same side. Not really. Hondo Ohnaka didn't wear armor. He didn't pledge loyalty, but when the galaxy turned to fire, he knew how to aim a blaster in the right direction. And the Jedi, they knew when not to ask questions. The alliance was never formal. It didn't need to be. A separatist base deep in the Onderon system, a crashed Republic shuttle on Felucia, a Jedi prisoner transport under attack near Selokami. Each time Hondo appeared. Sometimes too late, sometimes just in time, sometimes already looting the wreck before the Jedi arrived. But always, he had an excuse, and a reason to help. When Obi-Wan called for aid, Hondo responded, not because of honor, because of opportunity. He had grown skilled at knowing the value of a favor, especially one owed by the Jedi Council. During one mission, Republic forces were cut off by a droid battalion. The clones were running out of ammunition. The Jedi outnumbered. And then, from the sky, came pirate gunships, old, rusted, loud, painted with the skull that once made traders flee in fear. And yet, salvation. Hondo didn't charge in silence. He announced his arrival with fireworks. It was showmanship. It was spectacle. But it was also calculated. Because every life saved that day owed him something. The Jedi called it luck. But Hondo didn't believe in luck. He believed in transactions. The battle ended quickly. Separatist tanks reduced to scrap. Droids scattered. Jedi wounded, but alive. And Hondo, he was already negotiating salvage rights. Anakin protested. "You're stealing from the battlefield," he said. Hondo grinned. "I'm cleaning up the mess." Obi-Wan said nothing, because deep down he knew this was the cost. Every time the Jedi let Hondo walk free, every time they shook his hand instead of arresting him, they bought another day of survival. And Hondo knew it too. He used it. He positioned his gang at the edges of Republic-controlled space, not too close to be seen as a threat, not too far to be forgotten. He fed intel to the Jedi. He disrupted Separatist supply chains. He offered rescue for a price, but always with a smile. He never held a lightsaber, but he knew where they were pointed, and that gave him leverage. Ahsoka once asked him why he kept helping. Her tone was young, sharp, too honest. Hondo looked at her for a moment, the way one might look at a child asking why the stars burn. And then softly, he replied, "Because in a galaxy full of monsters, a man like me looks like a joke." She didn't laugh. She understood. He wasn't helping because he believed. He was helping because it made him harder to kill. But not everyone in the crew agreed. Some whispered that Hondo was growing soft, that his friendship with the Jedi was changing him, that he was losing the sharpness that made him feared. Hondo heard them. He let them speak. Then, when the time was right, he reminded them. He reminded them who had built the gang, who had survived Dooku, who had bled beside Jedi without becoming one, and who had walked away richer every time. Because friendship, in Hondo's world, was never real. It was a tool, and tools are meant to be used. It happened quickly, too quickly for anyone to stop. The deal was simple: a short escort through pirate territory, safe passage, minimal risk. Hondo had agreed without hesitation, smiling as always, waving his men into position. But this time, something felt wrong. The air was too quiet, the comms too still. Ahsoka sensed it first. Not danger, intention. The kind that forms before betrayal, when choice has already been made. By the time blasters were raised, it was over. She was separated from the others, disarmed, surrounded by pirates who avoided her eyes. Not violent, not cruel, just obedient. Hondo did not give the order himself. That was the truth. But he did not stop it either. She was taken to a holding chamber beneath the stronghold. The door sealed. The lights dimmed. And for the first time since leaving the Jedi Temple, Ahsoka felt truly alone. When Obi-Wan demanded answers, Hondo sighed. Not angrily, tired. He explained it calmly. One of his captains had made a deal with outside buyers. A temporary arrangement. A misunderstanding. All lies. But not all his. Because the moment Ahsoka was captured, the situation shifted beyond him. His own people were acting without permission now, testing limits, pushing boundaries, seeing how far his reputation could stretch. And Hondo knew what that meant. His control was slipping again. He didn't threaten Obi-Wan. He didn't mock him. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he offered wine and said something unexpected. "My friend, you should leave." Obi-Wan didn't move. He looked at Hondo the way he once looked at Anakin. Not with anger, but disappointment. "You're losing yourself." Hondo laughed softly. "No, I am remembering who I am." Because this was the truth. He never spoke aloud. Every time he grew close to the Jedi, something went wrong. Every time he stood too near their light, his shadow deepened. He could not exist in their world, not without consequences. Ahsoka was released hours later, not by negotiation, not by payment, by Hondo himself. He walked into the chamber alone. No guards, no weapons drawn, just a quiet man and a frightened Padawan. He didn't apologize. He simply said, "You should not trust me," and opened the door. When she rejoined Obi-Wan and Anakin, the relief was sharp. But something had changed. Trust had cracked, not shattered, but weakened. The Jedi left Florham that day without celebration. No thanks. No promises. Only a warning. Obi-Wan spoke it quietly, as if afraid the wind might hear. "One day, your luck will fail you." Hondo watched their ship rise into the sky. He did not respond, because he already knew. Luck does not last forever. That night, he stood alone at the edge of the stronghold, the same place he had once stood as a boy, staring into chaos and deciding how to survive it. Nothing had changed. The war was growing darker. The Jedi were drifting further from their ideals, the Republic tightening its grip, the Separatists growing more ruthless. And Hondo, he remained between them, too useful to kill, too dangerous to trust. Ahsoka's eyes stayed with him as the cruiser vanished into hyperspace, not with hatred, with sadness. And that unsettled him more than blasters ever could. Because sadness meant expectation. And expectation was something he could never fulfill. The war wanted sides, and Hondo chose neither. Not because he was afraid, but because choosing meant believing. And he didn't believe in anything. Not the Republic, not the Jedi, not the separatist dream of order. He had watched all of them up close, watched their soldiers bleed, watched their leaders lie. The only difference was the uniforms. He kept to the edge of it all, a ghost in the outer rim. One moment selling spice to separatist agents, the next recovering stolen cargo for the Jedi. Always moving, always smiling. Both sides learned to tolerate him because they needed him. His name became a shortcut in war briefings, a risk factor, a variable. Hondo Ohnaka marked in red across mission plans, sometimes as threat, sometimes as solution, but never as ally. Because Hondo wasn't loyal, not even to himself. He shifted shapes depending on who stood in front of him. A coward to generals, a comedian to clones, a friend to Jedi, a threat to everyone else. He knew they didn't trust him. He didn't want them to. Trust brings attachment. Attachment brings vulnerability. And Hondo had survived too long to make that mistake. Still, something lingered. He found himself remembering their names. Obi-Wan, Ahsoka, even Anakin, whose eyes always burned too brightly. He remembered their silence between battles, the way they spoke of peace like it was something real, the way they protected people who would never know their names. He didn't understand it, but he respected it. He told himself it was strategy, knowing your opponents, studying their minds. But when he sat alone in the cockpit, staring into hyperspace, the memories came too easily. Not like data, like ghosts. He had seen Jedi fall, He had watched clone troopers mourn their own. He had crossed fields of scorched armor, knowing that none of it belonged to him. And still, he felt something. Not guilt, but proximity. He had been close to honor, close to sacrifice, close to friendship, but never inside it. Because Hondo lived in the space between, and that space was growing smaller. The clone wars were turning. The separatists were becoming crueler. The Republic more desperate. Jedi dying faster. Planets falling harder. And neutrality was becoming extinction. He began to lose ships. Not in battle, but in silence. Crews disappearing. Raids intercepted. Deals collapsing. Whole sectors burned before he could reach them. It wasn't personal. It was war. And war does not remember pirates. Still, Hondo endured. Not by fighting harder, but by vanishing smarter. He stopped broadcasting. He stopped recruiting. He started using names that weren't his. Ghost channels. Disguised transponders. He became what the galaxy thought he had always been. A myth. A trickster. A rumor. A story whispered in cantinas. He let them believe he was dead. Because sometimes, that's the only way to stay alive. The Jedi stopped calling. The battles moved on. Florum faded from maps. The war marched toward Coruscant and left Hondo behind. Not defeated, not victorious, just unchanged. He never picked a side, and in doing so, he lost them all. The galaxy would not remember him as a hero, nor as a villain, only as the man who watched history burn from the outside, and chose not to stop it. For a moment, he had it all: ships, crews, territory, even respect, the rarest currency in the Outer Rim. Hondo Ohnaka had risen from a child scraping food off burnt decks to a man whose name turned heads in shadow ports and made Republic officers pause before speaking. The Ohnaka gang wasn't just a crew anymore. It was a network. Routes carved through uncharted space. Hidden caches of spice, fuel, coaxium. Disguised strongholds carved into asteroids and jungle valleys. Safe houses built with stolen credits and forgotten favors. His word, once laughed at, now opened doors. And for the first time in his life, Hondo believed it might last. He dressed better. Silk-lined coats, ornate shoulder guards, boots polished by men who once tried to kill him. He carried weapons he didn't need, not for protection, but for performance. Because performance mattered. He hosted gatherings now, pirate captains, disgraced nobles, droid smugglers with no masters. They came to him with respect, offers, gifts. He sat at the center of it all. The throne was not made of gold. It was made of influence, and like all things built on perception, it was hollow. The signs came slowly. First, a delay in shipments. Then, a missed payment from a client who'd always been early. A Republic patrol routed too close to one of his secondary depots. Small things, easy to ignore. Then, a captain defected. Took 5 ships with him. Claimed independence. Claimed Hondo had grown soft. Hondo let him go. He couldn't afford to look desperate. But the crew saw it, and they remembered. Loyalty, once earned with charm and credits, now required fear. And Hondo had never ruled by fear, and not convincingly. He began to adjust. More guards, more listening devices, less alcohol at meetings, fewer jokes. His smile remained, but thinner, stretched, slower to return. He began checking ship manifests himself, personally inspecting cargo, repeating orders more than once. It was subtle, but to those who had known him longest, it was clear. Hondo no longer trusted the throne he sat on, because it wasn't built on faith. It was built on timing, and time was running out. The Clone Wars had shifted. Worlds were falling faster now. The Jedi were stretched thin, separatists grew bolder, neutral systems stopped taking visitors. What once had been a wide-open playground for pirates was closing at the edges. And Hondo was not a warlord. He was a businessman in a burning market. Every victory began to feel like delay. Every deal, a coin flipped. The certainty that had once carried his voice, the weight that made his orders matter, it was fading. He walked his halls at night now, not out of nostalgia, out of fear. He watched the doors, the guards, the pilots, the droids. He listened to what they didn't say, what they avoided mentioning. And in the quiet spaces between conversations, he began to hear something he had forgotten long ago. Doubt. Not from them, from himself. He tried to drown it, with music, with spice, with noise. But ghosts do not sleep. They sit beside the crown and whisper what's already known. That power is never owned, only borrowed. And the return always comes due. It wasn't the enemies he feared. It was the familiar faces, the ones who no longer laughed when he entered the room, the ones who spoke carefully, the ones who waited before answering his questions. These were not rivals. They were veterans, men and women who had bled beside him, who had survived Dooku, Republic raids, separatist traps, who had trusted his instincts when nothing else made sense. Now they avoided his eyes. Because loyalty changes when power weakens. The first to challenge him did not raise a blaster. He raised a question. During a planning meeting, one of Hondo's oldest captains, a scarred Weequay named Gorin, asked why their roots were shrinking, why their profits were falling, why the Jedi no longer called. It was a fair question. Hondo answered with humor, a joke about markets, a comment about patience. No one laughed. That silence was louder than mutiny. After the meeting, crews began requesting transfers. Small groups asking for independent contracts. Ships leaving without ceremony. They didn't rebel. They drifted. And drift was worse, because it meant they no longer believed. Hondo tried to tighten his grip. He called old favors, enforced stricter shares, reassigned captains without discussion. Each decision made sense. Together, they sounded like panic. Rumors spread that he was losing his touch, that the Jedi had abandoned him, that the war had outgrown pirates like him. Some said the galaxy had moved on. Hondo pretended not to hear, but at night he replayed every choice, every compromise, every moment he had stood between sides instead of choosing one. Neutrality had once protected him. Now it isolated him. One evening, he received a message from a former ally, a smuggler queen who had once trusted him with entire fleets, and she declined his offer of partnership. No explanation, just silence. That hurt more than betrayal, because silence meant indifference. When you are feared, people react. When you are irrelevant, they do not. Soon, even his inner circle fractured. Whispers of replacing him surfaced, not through violence, through votes, agreements, new leadership structures, pirates pretending to be civilized. That was when Hondo understood the cruelest truth. He had taught them too well. He had built systems, codes, order, and now those systems no longer needed him. The throne was still there, but the room was emptying. He confronted Gorin privately, not with threats, with memory. He reminded him of early raids, of shared hunger, of survival. Gorin listened respectfully, then spoke the words Hondo feared most. "You taught us not to follow myths," he said, "only results." That night, Gorin left with 3 ships. Hondo did not stop him. He watched them lift into hyperspace, one by one, until the sky was empty again. The stronghold felt larger after that. too large, echoing. He began sleeping on his ship instead of the central chamber, surrounded himself with droids instead of people, automation instead of loyalty, because machines don't doubt, they don't judge, they don't leave. But even steel cannot replace belief. Each day, his empire shrank not through attack, but choice made by others. And the most painful realization of all was this: no one was trying to overthrow him. They were simply walking away. And that was something he could not fight. Collapse doesn't always come with fire. Sometimes it arrives without sound. One day, a cargo shipment never returns. The next, a contact goes dark. Then another, not because they were killed, but because they stopped answering. It wasn't treason. It wasn't sabotage. It was erosion. Hondo Ohnaka had survived empires. He had caged a Sith. He had traded with Jedi, bribed clones, stolen from generals. But now, the galaxy simply forgot to include him. He didn't notice it all at once. At first, he thought it was weather, bad luck, a temporary turn. Then the empty seats began appearing at meetings. Whole operations that once required coordination and layers of authorization were now silent. No requests, no questions, no need. One of his stations, a weapons depot buried beneath the moon of Darrelvan, sent a distress signal. He didn't respond. He waited. 12 hours later, another signal came. Not a cry for help. A message of departure. They had left the banner behind. No fighting, no looting. Just a crate of old credits and a note that read, "Thank you, we're done." He laughed when he read it. Then he sat down and didn't get up for a long time. The stronghold on Florum still stood. The droids still walked their routes. The security systems still blinked in time. But it all felt distant, like a place already buried, like a ruin being lived in. He tried to rally what was left, sent messages, offers, deals, generous cuts, old debts forgiven. He promised safety, resources, familiarity. Some answered, most did not, because the war was shifting again, and Hondo was not part of it. The empire was rising, slowly at first, quietly, but people felt it, the way gravity feels heavier just before the storm. And in that coming order, there was no room for pirates. He watched former rivals align themselves with newer powers, crime syndicates consolidating, Hutt space reorganizing, even old enemies forging alliances in fear of something larger. But no one looked to Hondo, because he was a relic, a shadow of chaos, a reminder of a time when the galaxy had more cracks to hide in. Now, those cracks were closing. He tried one last time, a massive raid, a show of force. He gathered the ships he still had, half the size of his former fleet, but enough. He targeted a separatist holdout station still operating in the mid-rim, a supply center. They attacked clean, efficient, and they won. But the haul was small. The losses were high, and the message was clear. No one cared. The Republic didn't notice. The separatists didn't retaliate. It wasn't a threat. It was noise. He returned to Florum. The halls were emptier than before. He walked them anyway. Each step echoed more than the last. Not because the stone had changed, but because the people were gone. The voices, the deals, the momentum, gone. He stood at the central chamber, the same one where he had once laughed over Dooku's capture, where Jedi had walked as guests, where pirates had toasted to their unlikely king. Now it was just dust. He looked at the throne. He didn't sit, because even he knew it no longer belonged to anyone. The title still followed him. Captain, King, leader of the Ohnaka gang. But titles lose meaning when spoken into empty rooms. There were no more councils, No crews requesting orders. No captains returning from raids. The hangars echoed with the hum of machines, left running out of habit, not purpose. He kept the lights on, not for visibility, but for memory. Because once this place had meant something. Now it stood like a monument to choices made too late. Hondo Ohnaka had never wanted to rule. Not truly. Power came to him because he understood how to wear it. Not because he desired what came with it. But power once held cannot be put down. It can only be dropped. And no one wanted to catch it. He sat alone at the edge of the command deck, boots propped on a crate, watching an old recording flicker on a cracked datapad. It was grainy footage, a raid from long ago, blasters firing, his voice laughing over comms. They had won that day. He had forgotten why they attacked. It didn't matter anymore. The credits from that haul were long spent. The crew scattered, some dead, some bought, some just tired. That was the part he hadn't expected, not betrayal. Fatigue. People grew weary of chaos. Eventually, even pirates want quiet. Something to hold, something to trust. Hondo could never offer that, because he didn't believe in it himself. Trust, to him, had always been a tool. Alliances, temporary. Loyalty, rented. And in that philosophy, he had kept himself safe. But now, with no one left to fool, the mask grew heavier. He still wore it, still smiled when he caught his reflection in the cracked glass, still spoke with flair when passing droids. But the silence always returned. He tried reaching out to old contacts, encrypted channels, names buried deep in memory. Most were gone. A few answered, politely, distantly, with the kind of tone reserved for a man no longer useful. The Empire was coming, and Hondo was not on their list. He received an offer, once. A distant voice promising him a place, a small post, manageable work, nothing flashy. It was real, secure. He didn't respond, because if he said yes, it would be over. Not the Empire, not the galaxy, Hondo. And he wasn't ready for that. So he stayed. Not because he believed the Ohnaka gang would rise again, but because leaving meant admitting that it wouldn't. There was one last ceremony, though he never called it that. He took down the banner, the laughing skull, once painted on ships, flags, walls, armor, now faded and torn, folded with slow hands. He didn't bury it. He stored it in a case, because even in endings, he held on to stories. That night, he sat in the main hall, alone, a single light above him, a bottle at his side. No speech, no audience, just a man sitting in the ruins of something he never meant to build. He raised the bottle once, half-hearted. To the ones who stayed, he whispered. Then, quieter, to the ones who left. And then, nothing. Just the quiet hum of systems still pretending the stronghold was alive. The clone wars would end, the Republic would fall, the Empire would rise, and in the dark, forgotten corner of a lawless world, Hondo Ohnaka would remain. Not as a leader, not as a legend, just as a man sitting beneath a crown no one wanted to wear. The last raid was small, just a scouting mission, low risk, a familiar route through the southern fringe of the mid-rim. 1 freighter, 2 escort ships, 6 men. Routine. They left at dawn and didn't return. No distress call, no message, no evidence. Just silence. At first, Hondo didn't panic. Ships went missing. Systems glitched. Maybe they were delayed. Maybe they'd found a better opportunity. Maybe they'd return late, laughing with twice the loot. He waited. A day passed. Then 2. No signal. No explanation. He checked the nav logs himself, confirmed the route. replayed their departure from the hangar, watched each of them board with casual confidence. Men who'd flown under his banner for years, now gone. He sent a scout, one ship, fast, quiet. It returned alone, no debris found, no wreckage, just empty space and a drifting beacon, one of theirs, still transmitting a green status light, as if nothing had happened. That was the first time in years Hondo stood still for hours, not thinking, just listening, to the air, to the absence, because that's how it started. Not with betrayal, not with explosions, with no one coming back. The hangars remained lit, but dimmer now. Fewer footsteps, fewer repairs. The crew stopped asking questions. They'd seen it before. Whole cells of pirates vanishing, not because of death, but because they had simply chosen to disappear. No farewell, just the sound of engines at night. And then, nothing. Another raid was scheduled, a new crew. Hondo briefed them himself, kept his voice light, his instructions clear. They nodded, saluted. They left. They didn't return either. And this time, he didn't ask why. He knew. They weren't dead. They were done. With the gang. With the name. With him. The silence spread like rot. Quarters once full, now sat abandoned. Droids patrolled empty hallways. Schedules went unchecked. Meetings went uncalled. He stopped wearing his coat, stopped adjusting his voice for authority. There was no one left to perform for. Even the doors began malfunctioning. Half the turrets unresponsive. One hangar bay permanently locked in standby mode. He didn't fix it, didn't need to. There was no one left to launch. He kept the lights on. That was his only rule. Don't sit in the dark. Because he'd done that before, as a child, held by people who saw him as nothing more than a tool. And later, as a captain, staring down Sith threats and Republic, deals with nothing but instinct to guide him. But this darkness was different. It wasn't dangerous. It was indifferent. And indifference is what kills legends. The crew didn't revolt. They didn't steal the treasury. They didn't set fire to the hangars or sell him to the Empire. They just left. Because they didn't need a gang anymore. They needed certainty. And Hondo Ohnaka could no longer provide it. His power wasn't taken. It was walked away from, one quiet step at a time. Until even the floor beneath him felt unfamiliar. Until even the air forgot his name. The name used to mean something. Ohnaka. It was carved into crates, painted on hulls, worn on armor plates, and shouted during raids. Now, it meant directions, a waypoint, a coordinate, a reminder of where something used to be. No one called it a betrayal. No one called it anything. Because names fade faster than people admit. And the Ohnaka gang, once feared across outer rim lanes, no longer existed. Not officially, not in action. It didn't collapse in fire or in fighting. It drifted. One captain left to explore new sectors. Another asked to go independent. A third never returned from a supply run. Each exit came with a reason, a nod, a half promise to come back. None did. The banner remained, but no one saluted it. The codes still unlocked doors, but no one followed them. And the title of captain echoed through hallways, no longer listening. It was as if the gang had collectively agreed to forget, not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of survival. The Empire was rising, and Hondo Ohnaka was not welcome in that world. The name Ohnaka no longer inspired dread. It invited questions. Who was he? Why hadn't he chosen a side? What use was a pirate who played both ends of a war that no longer existed? Even those who remembered the old days The Dooku capture, the Jedi negotiations, the vanished strongholds spoke his name with hesitation. As if unsure if he was myth or mistake, he felt it most in the comms silence. Once, dozens of encrypted messages poured in daily. Offers, warnings, negotiations. Now, static. Even the bounty hunters stopped sending threats. It wasn't respect. It was dismissal. One night, Hondo pulled up the crew registry. Pages once filled with names, statuses, updates, now mostly empty. Dozens marked inactive. Some listed as lost. Others left completely blank, their last locations unknown. He scrolled without blinking, past the ones he remembered, past the ones he trusted, past the ones he feared. All gone, not by force, by choice. That was the hardest part. They hadn't been taken. They had left. Because somewhere along the way, the gang became optional. And when loyalty becomes optional, it becomes memory. Hondo didn't rage. He didn't call them cowards. He poured himself a drink, sat by the window, watched the distant storms roll across Florum's broken sky. He remembered building it. Not the stronghold, the idea. The belief that he could be something more than a background player in someone else's war. That a pirate could have structure. That chaos could wear a smile and still command loyalty. And for a while, it had worked. Until the galaxy changed. Not with explosions, with forgetting. The new crews, the young pilots, the rising smugglers. They didn't know the name. Didn't remember the laugh, didn't believe the stories. He was still alive, but the legend had died. Not with a fall, with silence. And in that silence, he sat. Not as a leader, not as a captain, just as a man wondering when exactly the name Ohnaka had become an echo. He always expected it would end with blasters, maybe a knife, maybe poison. A final betrayal from someone close, a dramatic showdown in the hangar. Last words, last laughs. But that's not how it happened. The final betrayal didn't come with shouting. It came with a locked door. He returned from a supply run, alone, as always, and the inner gate didn't open. He tried the override code. No response. Manual control. Offline. The security droid, once programmed to greet him by name, turned away when it saw his face. No alarm, no alert, just indifference. He stood outside the gate for a long time, just rain sweeping across the landing pad, wind pulling at his coat. Then the lights dimmed, and he understood. They weren't trying to kill him. They were removing him. A quiet transition, not a mutiny. A handoff, to no one in particular, because by now there was no leader, no captain, just a system too large to need him. He laughed, a soft, dry sound. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. He had taught them this: redundancy, autonomy, initiative. He had built the Ohnaka gang to survive anything, even him, and now it had. Without ceremony, without violence, just replacement. He didn't try to break in. He didn't shout. He returned to his ship, a smaller model, half-fueled, stocked more for drifting than for war. He sat in the pilot's chair and let the engines hum. Then he lifted off. No resistance, no goodbye. The last transmission he received came 4 days later. A brief message from an old crew member, voice distorted, name removed. It was time, you understand. He deleted it, not out of spite, out of peace. Because they were right. It was time, not just for them, for him. To stop pretending the past could be preserved in salvage bays and half-loyal crews. To stop thinking legends were built to last. He drifted for a while. No destination, no plan. Florum vanished behind him like a closed door. He passed old smuggling lanes, empty, patrols rerouted, borders reshaped by the Empire's slow advance. He didn't hide, but no one looked for him, and that was the final truth. The betrayal hadn't been cruelty. It had been evolution. They didn't hate him. They had outgrown him, and he had let them, because Hondo Ohnaka had never been a tyrant, just a survivor, and survival sometimes meant leaving before they asked you to. He found a moon eventually, uncharted, unclaimed, a scarred rock with no value, no power, no audience. It suited him. He landed, stepped out, and listened to the silence. Not lonely. Not yet. He brought only what mattered: a coat, a blaster, and the last untouched bottle of the first celebration he ever hosted, unopened, for 20 years. He didn't drink it. He placed it on a ledge, faced the stars, sat. He didn't cry. He didn't laugh. He just was. And in that stillness, he finally understood. The final betrayal had not come from his crew. It had come from time. No one came looking. Not the Jedi. Not the Empire. Not even old enemies. Time passed. Quietly. Even the stars seemed to move slower now. He stopped checking the nav console. There was nowhere left to go. The moon he'd chosen was barren. The wind carried dust, not stories. There were no settlements, no ruins, nothing to steal. And for once, that was enough. The stronghold on Florum remained intact, orbiting in the background of fading rumors. Some said it had been abandoned. Others said it was now controlled by a new syndicate. Hondo didn't care. It wasn't his anymore. He thought he might feel something: anger, regret, loss. But what he felt most was stillness. The kind that arrives after a long noise. The kind that lingers when everyone else has left. He'd lived in chaos for so long, he forgot what silence sounded like. Now it echoed. Sometimes he'd wake up before dawn and hear voices in the wind, laughter that wasn't there, footsteps that belonged to no one. He never investigated. Ghosts don't need answers, just remembrance. He kept a small transmitter by his cot. It wasn't connected to any major channel. No beacon. Just a static frequency that looped old recordings, memories no one else would recognize. His own voice. Briefings from old missions. The sound of the gang singing after a raid. None of it useful. All of it real. Because in the end, stories were all he'd ever truly owned. He walked the ridge most evenings, hands behind his back, eyes on the sky, waiting for a ship that would never come. He didn't feel forgotten. He felt completed, like a page that had finally stopped being written on. The pirate, the trickster, the survivor. He still lived inside him. But now there was no need to prove it. He had nothing left to steal, nothing left to sell, nothing left to lead. And for the first time in his life, that felt safe. The galaxy was quieter now, at least from where he stood. Hondo imagined the wars still raged in far-off systems, empires rising, rebels forming, old powers becoming new monsters. But he wasn't part of it anymore. He had chosen something rarer than survival. He had chosen silence, and in that silence, he began to hear something different, his own voice. Not the one he used in negotiations, not the performer, not the pirate king, the voice beneath it all, calm, tired, clear. He spoke aloud sometimes, not to anyone, just to remember what speaking felt like when no one was listening. Stories, warnings, jokes, they all sounded the same now. Once, his words could sway fleets. Now, they stirred only dust. He sat beneath a broken antenna one night, the last remnant of his ship. She long since decommissioned, and whispered, it wasn't failure, it was time. No one heard, but he smiled anyway, because he believed it. The Ohnaka gang hadn't died. It had ended. Not in shame, not in violence, just in silence. And silence was the only honest ending a pirate could ever ask for. The stars had changed. They used to sing, quietly, but always there. Each one was a promise, a destination, a hidden deal waiting in the shadows of some forgotten system. But now they just floated, cold, silent, uninterested. Hondo Ohnaka no longer had a crew, no banner, no name worth fearing. He was just a face among many, an aging pirate in a galaxy that had no use for pirates anymore. The Empire had seen to that. The war had ended, not with balance, not with peace, but with silence. One side had won, the other had vanished. And somewhere in between, men like Hondo had simply fallen through the cracks. He wasn't hunted, he wasn't celebrated, he was ignored. At first, he tried to fight it. He moved from system to system, hoping to stir up old rivalries, spark new chaos. She reclaimed something, anything, of what he'd built. But everywhere he went, the response was the same. Stormtroopers didn't negotiate. Imperial officers didn't bribe easily. And the underworld, it had changed too. It had become smaller, meaner, less loyal. Hondo learned quickly. The Empire didn't just conquer planets. It poisoned the spaces between people. No one trusted each other. No one worked together unless forced. The great pirate alliances were gone. Smugglers worked solo. Slavers worked in silence. And bounty hunters served the Empire now. For the first time in his life, Hondo had no leverage. And yet, he survived. He always survived. Sometimes that meant pretending to be useful, selling maps to old Clone Wars wrecks, offering fake intel about Jedi fugitives, trading stories for food. Hondo lied for credits, for safe passage, for the illusion of relevance. Other times, he stole. Not grand raids like before, just small things, fuel cells, rations, a speeder bike from a distracted trooper. He told himself it was temporary, that the galaxy would turn again, that he was just waiting, watching. But years passed, and he didn't feel like Hondo anymore. He still wore the same coat, patched now, threadbare at the cuffs. His belt still carried the same weapons, though he hadn't fired them in months. His ship, the Fortune and Glory, had long since been dismantled and sold off in pieces. Now he travelled by whatever means he could, stowed away, bartered for, or simply walked. People didn't recognize him. Or worse, they remembered and laughed. The legendary pirate who once captured Count Dooku, the madman who toyed with Jedi, who sold to the Republic and the Separatists in the same week, now reduced to trading salvage on backwater moons. Sometimes he stared into old datapads, watching the last recorded footage of his crew. He could still name each one. Their voices still echoed in the quiet moments, but he didn't say their names out loud. It felt like betrayal, as if speaking them in this new galaxy would stain the memories. So he drifted, from Ord Mantell to Florum's forgotten ruins, from smuggler dens on Socorro to the broken shadow ports of Ryloth. He stayed in the shadows, and the Empire let him, because the Empire didn't fear ghosts. And that's what he'd become. They still called him Captain. Sometimes, old smugglers, lost friends, those who remembered the days of spice runs and separatist bribes, they'd greet him with a grin and say, Captain Ohnaka, out of habit. But there was no crew, no ship, no orders to give. The title had become a joke, a relic like the trinkets he carried in his satchel, things with no place in this new galaxy. Once, flags meant something. A pirate's symbol was more than just cloth. It was identity, a warning, a claim. When Hondo's sigil flew, people took notice. Some ran, some fought, all remembered. But now, no one cared about pirate banners. The Empire had made sure of that. Their own flag flew everywhere. Cold, perfect, identical. He used to see it as a challenge, something to disrupt, to steal from, to mock. But with time, the boldness faded. The risks grew. The payoff shrank. In this new order, power wasn't stolen anymore. It was bought quietly or passed between elites. And Hondo, he had nothing left to trade. He tried assembling new crews more than once. He found hungry men in the outer systems, desperate faces in cantinas, fighters with nothing to lose. But they didn't understand what piracy used to mean. They weren't loyal. They weren't clever. They didn't dream of riches or freedom. They just wanted to survive. Hondo led them anyway. He stole a cargo barge, repainted it, renamed it Midnight Memory. It sounded dramatic, grand, but it flew like a dying bantha and leaked air from the rear hold. They ran 2 jobs. The first went well. Imperial scrap, unmarked lanes, no witnesses. The second, a disaster, a double cross. One of his new crews sold them out mid-flight. Hondo barely escaped. 2 of the others didn't. He didn't go back for them. Not because he didn't care, but because he'd learned, in this galaxy, going back was a mistake. So he let the ship drift, sold what was left of it to a Duros merchant, and walked away from that crew like he had so many others. He stopped trying after that, not just to rebuild, but to belong. Hondo had always been a performer, a storyteller, a liar maybe, but he believed his lies, just enough to make others believe too. That was the secret. That was the power. But now, even the lies felt empty. He told one once, to a young slicer on Corellia, said he'd once owned 10 ships, had dined with Grievous, had stolen treasure from the Jedi temple itself. The boy listened, eyes wide, believed every word, and then asked the one question Hondo didn't expect. If you were that great, why are you here? He didn't answer, because he didn't know. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't planning, he was just there, breathing, drifting, watching others become what he used to be. The stars didn't shine the same. Space wasn't freedom anymore. It was cold, empty distance. He missed the noise, the arguments, the laughter over cheap drinks, the thrill of boarding a ship and taking what wasn't his. He missed being feared. Now, he wasn't feared. He wasn't followed. He was forgotten. A pirate without a flag, a captain without a crew, a man with stories no one wanted to hear. But he still told them, to himself, to shadows, to droids who couldn't care less. Because if the stories stopped, then maybe he'd stop too. And Hondo Ohnaka wasn't ready to disappear just yet. There were scars no one could see. Not the ones on his arms from prison cells. Not the thin line across his ribs from a vibroblade once held by a friend. Those healed, faded, became part of the myth. But the real wounds, they stayed hidden. Behind the eyes, behind the silence. Hondo had never liked silence. In the old days, he filled every room with noise, laughter, arguments, drunken songs, bold lies, dramatic pauses. He never let a second pass without a reason to speak. It kept people off balance. It kept him in control. Now there were hours, days even, where he didn't say a word. Not because he didn't want to, but because there was no one left to hear him. He found shelter in abandoned outposts, empty spice mines, decommissioned listening stations left behind by both the Republic and separatists, quiet places, forgotten places. He wandered them like a ghost. Sometimes he'd sit in the control chairs and pretend to give orders, pretend a crew answered back, pretend the hum of the console meant something was still alive. But most of the time, there was only the cold hum of power systems half broken and the wind outside scraping against metal. He remembered names, too many names. Turba, the big one, always the first into a fight, always the last to run. Pilf Mukmuk, half mad, half brilliant, could slice into anything with enough spice and time. Lando, that charming liar, not one of his crew, but close enough to count. A mirror of what Hondo could have been, if he'd worn cleaner clothes and smiled more politely. And Kenobi. Jedi, yes, but not just that. There was something almost respectful between them. A strange rhythm, the kind of tension that comes not from hatred, but from understanding. They were all gone now, dead, missing, changed, moved on. And he remained. It wasn't just the galaxy that changed. It was him. Once, he could smell opportunity in the air, like spice, like fuel, like smoke before a fire. It thrilled him. It made him sharp. Now, it just smelled like rust and rain. He stopped chasing things, stopped planning jobs, stopped wearing the jacket with medals no one remembered. But he couldn't stop remembering. One day, he found an old Ohnaka gang datapad buried in a crate. It had a crew manifest still logged in. Their last route, their last heist. A joke someone typed in the notes. He stared at it for a long time, then closed the file and left it there, because opening it again would mean admitting it was over. He told himself he was just waiting, that something big would come along, that the galaxy wasn't done with him yet. But deep down, he feared the truth, that maybe the best parts of him had already happened, and the rest was just echoes. Still, something kept him moving, even when he didn't know why. He'd trade stories for credits, lies for fuel, a stolen relic here, a smuggled droid part there, just enough to keep going. He wasn't trying to be a legend anymore. He was trying not to be forgotten. He once whispered a toast into an empty room, to the ones who followed me and the ones who left. The glass slipped from his hand, broke against the floor. He didn't pick it up, didn't move, just stared at the shards. Because in that moment, the silence wasn't around him. It was inside him. And even he couldn't laugh it away anymore. He didn't see the boy until the firelight moved. A quiet flicker in the distance, faint, almost unreal, like someone had lit a match in the middle of space. Hondo crept toward it, careful with his steps. Not for the boy, for himself. Trust was expensive now, and in this galaxy it always came at a price. The boy was maybe 10, dust-covered, half-starved, sitting beside the wreckage of a crashed speeder, warming his hands against a weak flame that wouldn't last the night. He didn't flinch when Hondo stepped into view, didn't run, didn't speak, just looked. That kind of silence wasn't normal in children. It came from loss. The kind that didn't heal. Hondo understood. He sat down across from him, said nothing at first, just let the warmth of the flame rest between them like a fragile truce. Finally, he pulled a small ration pack from his coat and slid it across the dirt. The boy didn't thank him, just tore it open and ate like someone who hadn't had a full meal in days. When it was done, he finally spoke. "You a pirate?" Hondo raised an eyebrow. "Once," he said. "Maybe still. Depends on the day." The boy stared at the fire. "My dad said pirates were cowards, said they ran when things got bad." Hondo didn't argue. He didn't need to defend his past anymore. Instead, he looked at the boy with tired eyes and said, "Then your father was lucky. He never had to decide between pride and survival." Silence again. The boy didn't push. Hondo didn't explain. But something shifted. A small thing, barely visible. Trust. The boy traveled with him for a few days. Said his name was Jax. No last name, no planet. Just a name and a silence too deep for someone so young. Hondo didn't ask for more. He taught the boy how to spot sensor drones, how to hotwire an old freighter, how to bluff stormtroopers with nothing but confidence and a borrowed uniform. He told himself it was temporary, that the kid would leave like all the others. But when Jax asked, "Were you ever rich?" something cracked open. He told stories of treasure rooms beneath Florum, of spice caravans too heavy to lift, of 1,000 credits earned in a single lie. Jax laughed, genuinely, for the first time, and Hondo felt it, a flicker, not of power, not of command, but of purpose. The galaxy was darker now, more dangerous, more silent, but in that small flame between them, something warm still lived. For a moment, he wasn't the last pirate. He wasn't the ruin of a legend. He was a teacher, a survivor, a shadow still moving. But shadows fade. One morning, Jax was gone. No note, no goodbye, just vanished. And Hondo understood. That's what the galaxy taught you. Never stay too long. Never love too deeply. Never hope too much. He didn't go looking for him. Didn't search. Didn't blame him. Instead, he sat where the boy once slept and whispered to the wind, "Good. Now you'll survive." And he meant it, because survival wasn't about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go. And so, Hondo stood, dusted off his coat, tightened the strap on his blaster, and walked back into the fog. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. Not glory, not power, not the past, just the next light in the distance. And maybe one day, someone would remember the pirate who didn't stop, even when everything else had.
He had seen all kinds of fools in his time, warriors who charged without cover, smugglers who thought they were cleverer than the scanners, children who believed they were invincible. But this Ezra Bridger, was different. He wasn't brave the way soldiers were, and he wasn't foolish the way street thieves often were. He had something else, something that made even Hondo pause, a kind of hope that didn't fit the galaxy anymore. Not since the Empire. Not since the silence. They met in the shadows, as most things happen now. The bright suns of glory days had long set. There were no more flags, no more crews. Hondo moved from one scheme to another, not for wealth, but to feel something. Anything. The boy was young, maybe too young to know what this galaxy really was. And yet, when the stormtroopers came, Ezra didn't hide. He stepped forward, not with a blaster, but with a look in his eyes that said, "I'm not afraid of you." That surprised him. Hondo had survived by never truly taking sides. He played both ends, laughed with Jedi, drank with bounty hunters, lied to separatists, and swore loyalty to Republic officers, all in the same breath. But here was someone who chose a side without being asked, who risked everything without expecting anything in return. The boy should have died that day, but he didn't, not because he was powerful or clever or lucky. He lived because he was willing to protect people he barely knew. And when the blaster fire stopped, when the smoke cleared, Hondo realized he had helped the boy without thinking, without a deal. That was the beginning of the trouble. He told himself it was just business. Helping the ghost crew could lead to rewards. Maybe a stolen crate or two, a shipment of blasters left unguarded, a small price for trust. But that wasn't what stayed with him. It was the way Ezra looked at him, not with fear, not with flattery, but with belief, as if, somehow, Hondo still mattered. It was dangerous, because Hondo had spent years convincing himself he didn't care, that the crew was gone, that his empire was dust, that he was better off alone. But in Ezra, he saw a version of himself that never got to exist, younger, purer, not yet broken. He tried to shake it off, tried to treat Ezra like all the others. My friend, he would say, with that same grin, that same old charm. But it was different now. The words didn't land the same. Ezra wasn't fooled by them. And worse, he didn't need to be. He liked Hondo anyway. It felt like looking into a mirror that reflected the past. Not the old glory, but something before that. Something buried. They traveled together, sometimes missions that weren't always clean, deals that Hondo pretended were clever. But Ezra never judged him, even when Hondo lied, even when Hondo ran. The boy still came back, still called him a friend. It should have been weakness, but it wasn't. In a galaxy that punished loyalty, Ezra carried it like armor. And Hondo, without meaning to, found himself standing beside him when it counted. Not because he was paid, not because he was cornered, but because something about the boy made him feel seen. And that was the most dangerous part. Because Hondo Ohnaka had survived countless battles, escaped every prison, outsmarted Jedi, and outdrank Hutts. But he had never escaped himself, never faced the part of him that still wanted to be believed in, until now. And all it took was a boy who wouldn't run. The past never truly leaves you. It waits in the corners of old spaceports, behind faces that remind you of someone you betrayed, or someone who left you behind. For Hondo Ohnaka, the Jedi were that shadow. He had mocked them once, sold them, captured them, bartered their lives like spice or coaxium. And yet, there had always been something about them, not power, not even mystery, but peace, a peace Hondo never understood, one that made him uncomfortable. So when he found himself standing aboard the Ghost, looking at Kanan Jarrus, a Jedi who shouldn't have survived Order 66, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, unease. Kanan was calm, quiet, watchful. He didn't smile the way Obi-Wan once did. Didn't argue like Anakin. He just looked at Hondo, like he was trying to decide if he saw a threat or a tragedy. And Hera, the Twi'lek pilot, didn't trust Hondo at all. She saw through his charm instantly. But Ezra still believed in him. That made all the difference. Hondo didn't understand their mission. Rebel cells, coded transmissions, stolen cargo for the cause. He wasn't built for rebellion. He didn't dream of empires falling. He dreamed of vaults opening. But every time he tried to walk away, something pulled him back. And then came the droids. Imperial probes, deadly and precise, caught them in a forgotten depot on Garrel. Trapped. No exit. The plan had failed. As blasters fired, it was Hondo, not Kanan, who found the back route, who carried Chopper. C1, 10P, on his back through collapsing doors, who came back when he could have escaped. He didn't do it for glory, or credits, or to be a hero. He did it because he couldn't watch Ezra die. He told himself it was strategy, that he was protecting his investment. But when Kanan found him, burnt and bruised, waiting by the Ghost's landing ramp, he didn't ask questions. He just looked at Hondo, nodded once, and said, "Thank you." That word had hit harder than any punch. There were no cheers, no medals, just silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Later, in the quiet of hyperspace, Hondo found a datapad left behind. It held names, Jedi who had died, Jedi who had survived, Jedi who had never turned away even when the galaxy gave up on them. Obi-Wan, gone. Anakin, worse. And yet, here was Kanan, teaching Ezra, risking everything to pass on the very thing the Empire tried to erase: hope. Hondo remembered the past, but not as stories. He remembered the fear in his crew's eyes when Grievous had attacked. He remembered the helplessness as Count Dooku nearly killed them all. And he remembered the calm, infuriating way Obi-Wan had smiled. Even when held hostage, the Jedi weren't fools. They were something else. And now they were ghosts. Not gone, just scattered, hidden in the Force, waiting for moments like this. Moments when a boy with no training could stand against a Sith. Moments when an old pirate could choose to stay, even when running was easier. Hondo never said the word. He never called them friends. But somewhere, in the way he checked Ezra's gear before a mission, in the way he made sure the crew had an escape route, in the way he smiled at Kanan, even when they disagreed, he was trying not to become one of them, but to stop pretending he hadn't once wished he could be. And maybe that was enough. There had always been a rule, one simple code, that Hondo Ohnaka lived by. If there is no profit, there is no point. But something was changing. Slowly, quietly. It didn't feel like betrayal. Not at first. It felt like confusion. He began doing things he couldn't explain, joining missions with no treasure, smuggling supplies he didn't keep, fighting battles he didn't start. The moment that broke the rule came on Nixus, a remote fueling station, buried deep in a gas cloud. Perfect for black market trade, or so Hondo thought. He had brought Ezra there, claiming they'd find valuable coaxium. But what they found instead was a trap. Imperial agents had already taken the station, not stormtroopers. ISB, cold, surgical. They weren't after Hondo. They were after information, the kind rebels carried in encrypted drives. And somehow, Ezra had won. Hondo could have run. In fact, he tried. But halfway through the escape tunnel, he stopped. He looked back, and for the first time in his life, the question hit him. What if I don't leave him? Ezra was cornered, blaster out, but shaking. The drive was clutched in his hand, and he looked small, too small for a war like this. And then Hondo returned. No plan, no backup. Just a distraction loud enough to draw the fire. He threw flash bombs, shouted his name, taunted the agents. And when Ezra slipped away, it wasn't victory that Hondo felt. It was silence. The agents nearly killed him, but Hera came back for him. Later, stitched up and half-conscious in the ghost's medbay, Hondo laughed. There was no profit in that, he said. No, Kanan replied. But there was trust. That word. Again. Trust wasn't a currency Hondo understood. He knew leverage. He knew secrets. But trust was different. You couldn't sell it, couldn't steal it. You had to give it. And once given, it stayed. That's what scared him. Because trust leads to loss. He remembered his old crew, every one of them. Some gone to greed, some gone to fear, some just gone. He had trusted too many and lost too much. But here he was, risking his life not for treasure, but for people. People he couldn't control. Ezra, Kanan, even that droid, Chopper, C1, 10P. They fought for something they might never see. A free galaxy, a future without fear. Hondo didn't believe in futures, but he did believe in now. And in the now, they mattered. He never said it, never admitted it, but his actions betrayed him. He gave the rebels a list of his old smuggling routes. He smuggled food instead of spice. He lied to Imperial patrols to buy time for a rebel cell to escape, and he never once asked for payment. At night, in his bunk aboard a stolen freighter, he would stare at the ceiling and whisper, "What is happening to me?" There was no answer, just the quiet hum of hyperspace, and the soft rhythm of a galaxy still fighting to breathe. The old Hondo would have laughed at this. He would have called it weakness. But the new Hondo, the one bruised, older, lonelier than he'd admit, he didn't laugh. He just closed his eyes and waited for morning. Because somehow, without even knowing when it began, he had started to care. And for a man like Hondo Ohnaka, that was the most dangerous risk of all. There was a time when Hondo Ohnaka believed in nothing, not governments, not orders, not Jedi, and certainly not hope. He believed in survival, in credits, in the next shipment, the next job, the next lie. Belief to him had always been a tool, something others used to explain failure, or to walk into war for nothing. But belief has a strange way of creeping in, not through arguments or speeches, but through small, quiet moments that refuse to leave. For Hondo, belief came in the form of Ezra Bridger. The boy reminded him of himself, but not the Hondo that laughed, cheated, and ran. No, Ezra reminded him of the boy he once was, before the gangs, before the syndicates, before the name Ohnaka carried fear. Ezra still had something pure, not naive, not soft, just unbroken. That's what scared Hondo. He didn't want to protect it, but he did. Because if Ezra survived, if that spark lived on, maybe not everything in the galaxy was lost. He didn't join the rebellion. Not really. There was no oath, no rank, no uniform. He came and went, helped when he felt like it, lied when he had to, vanished when it got too heavy. But the things he carried, those told the real story. He transported stolen TIE parts through Imperial checkpoints, not for money, for cause. He smuggled holocrons to Jedi survivors hiding in shadows. He got 3 rebel families off Lothal before the blockades closed. He never even learned their names. And one day, in the middle of a freezing night, on an abandoned mining world, he gave Ezra something strange, something he'd never parted with before. A necklace. It wasn't valuable, just bone and thread, but it was old, from his clan, long before he was a pirate, before the wars. Ezra had looked confused. Why me? And Hondo, in a voice too soft to be heard by anyone else, said, "Because you're still good." That moment didn't make him a hero. It didn't erase the things he'd done, but it was real. And in a galaxy run by fear, something real was worth more than any cargo. Belief wasn't about banners or leaders. It was about people. Hera, who never gave up. K-Man, who saw through him but still helped. Ezra, who forgave before understanding. And even Chopper, C1, 10P, the droid who never trusted him, but always saved his life. They weren't his crew, but they were something close, something better. He watched them risk everything, not for power, but for each other. And one day, he started doing the same, without noticing, without planning. He had become part of something bigger, not because he changed who he was, but because he let one part of himself, the part he buried long ago, live again, the part that wanted to believe in something, in someone, in the idea that a pirate could be more than just a survivor. He didn't say goodbye when he left the ghost crew, just vanished. That was his way. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be the end, because belief, once it takes root, doesn't leave. It follows, like a shadow, like a spark waiting to catch fire. He still lied, still cheated, still ran, but now Sometimes he stopped, just long enough to help. And when the stories of the rebellion spread across the stars, whispered in the dark corners of cantinas, some would say a strange weak way had helped them, not for money, not for fame, just for reasons he never explained. Because belief, once earned, is the one cargo you never lose, even if you're a pirate. Even if your name is Hondo Ohnaka. Most pirates are forgotten. Their stories drift away like broken signals in the void, lost to time, buried under centuries of louder wars and louder men. And yet, his name remained, not because of greatness, not because of honor, but because he simply refused to vanish. Hondo Ohnaka should have disappeared long ago. He wasn't a Jedi. He didn't follow the Force. He didn't wear armor or wield a lightsaber. In a galaxy where destiny belonged to the powerful, he had no reason to endure. And yet, across the outer rim, in the cracks between empires, people still whispered his name, sometimes with fear, sometimes with laughter, but always with recognition. There were no statues of him, no temples, no monuments carved in stone. His legacy was made of rusted ship parts, broken deals, and half-true stories passed between smugglers who didn't believe in heroes. And maybe that was enough, because Hondo didn't want worship. He only wanted survival. But survival is a strange kind of myth. It doesn't roar. It lingers. After the fall of the Republic, after the rise of the Empire, after the death of almost every major figure he ever crossed, Hondo was still breathing, still scheming, still moving. While Jedi were hunted, while clones were replaced, while separatists were erased from history, the pirate from Florum kept slipping through the cracks. Not because he was lucky, but because he understood something most people didn't. He knew how to disappear without being gone. He knew how to keep just enough friends, owe just the right favors, and leave just enough behind for someone to remember him by. In the age of the Empire, survival was silence. But Hondo made noise in clever ways. He didn't rebel. He didn't resist. He endured. And endurance, over time, begins to look like legacy. On smuggler moons and backwater spaceports, old spacers told stories of him, stories that blurred fact and fiction. The time he captured Count Dooku, Kenobi, and Skywalker all at once. The time he betrayed the Jedi, and then helped them, and then stole from both sides before vanishing with the loot. The time he ran a gang so powerful that the Republic considered dealing with him instead of fighting him. Some stories were true, some weren't. Hondo wouldn't have cared either way. Truth, for him, had always been flexible. But memory was currency. He had once said that respect was more valuable than credit. He rarely lived by those words, but somehow he earned both. The Ohnaka gang was gone. His stronghold on Florum had collapsed. His crew had scattered or died. And yet, the galaxy still remembered. Because in a time when empires rose and fell overnight, there was something powerful about someone who simply lasted. There was something mythic in someone who kept showing up when logic said he shouldn't. He became the kind of man children heard about in old cantinas, the kind of man rebels cursed and thanked in the same breath. To some, he was a nuisance. To others, a legend. To himself, he was just Hondo. And that, somehow, was enough. Because in the end, the ones who matter most aren't always the strongest. They're the ones who refuse to fade, the ones who adapt, the ones who slip between the cracks of history and build a life in the shadows of giants. Hondo Ohnaka was never meant to be remembered, but he was. Not because he changed the galaxy, but because he refused to let it erase him. And in the great silence of time, that might be the loudest thing of all. He was not in the records of great generals, not in Jedi archives, nor Sith prophecies, Hondo Ohnaka had never been chosen for anything. Not by the Force, not by history. He had carved his name into the side of the galaxy by force of will. And now that name was slipping into silence. After the fall of the Republic, there was no grand pursuit for him. No bounties posted, no manhunts launched. The Empire didn't care about pirates, not ones like him, not ones already falling apart. He wandered from world to world, chasing rumors that didn't exist, hidden caches of spice, forgotten separatist faults, even whispers of Jedi survivors, hoping perhaps to trade their names for credits. But each lead ended the same, in disappointment or betrayal, or worse, nothing at all. Sometimes he told stories in cantinas to get a meal. Sometimes he stole fuel from a dockyard, escaping in a ship that barely held together. And sometimes he just sat in silence, remembering there was no crew anymore, no gang, no we, just the echo of voices long gone. Some dead, some missing. Some who had simply walked away when the profits dried up and the risks became too large. He missed their arguments, their laughter, even their incompetence. At least back then, it had felt like something was being built, even if it was built on sand. The galaxy moved on without him, faster than he expected, faster than he could follow. On Corellia, he was turned away from a job by a young smuggler who didn't even recognize his name. On Ord Mantell, a criminal syndicate took over the port he once controlled, and none of them knew it had ever been his. He watched from a rooftop as they loaded their ships, wearing armor with no honor, carrying weapons they didn't earn, but he didn't interfere. He just watched. Then he walked away. Even his clothes felt wrong. His old armor was patched together now. His once vibrant scarf was torn, faded, barely clinging to his shoulders. The goggles he wore were cracked, and he didn't bother replacing them. He said it helped him see the galaxy for what it was. Broken. He had become a ghost, and not a feared one. And yet, he kept going. He didn't know why. There was no purpose, no mission, not even revenge, just this strange, stubborn momentum, as if his legs didn't know how to stop moving, as if the galaxy wasn't done with him yet, even if it had no more use for him. He tried not to think of the past, but the memories came anyway. The first time he captured Count Dooku, the day he held a lightsaber he could never truly wield, the time he fought alongside Jedi, and against them, all of it played out behind his eyes at night, when the silence was too loud. He laughed less. He lied less, not because he had grown wise, but because no one was listening. Some nights, he talked to himself, called out names that had no echo, told jokes with no one to hear the punchline. On one moon, he toasted to his own survival, sitting alone with a stolen bottle of Mandalorian ale. And when the drink was done, he whispered into the wind, "I was something once, wasn't I?" No one answered. And that was the worst part. Not the hunger, not the danger, but the quiet. The absolute quiet that came when the galaxy forgets you ever mattered. But somewhere beneath that silence, something still burned. Not pride, not even hope. Just a faint flicker of belief that maybe, somehow, this wasn't the end of his story, even if it should have been. Ezra Bridger should have known better. The first time he met Hondo Ohnaka, there was no trust, only opportunity. Hondo was running another scheme. Prisoners he planned to trade, credits he hadn't yet earned, and a mouthful of promises he never planned to keep. But the galaxy has a strange way of choosing its moments, and sometimes what begins as manipulation turns into something far more unexpected. Hondo had tried to sell him, literally, but Ezra didn't react with fury or fear. He played the game, matched Hondo's lies with calm defiance, escaped when the odds were stacked, and that caught Hondo's attention more than any bribe ever could. He reminded him of someone. Not a name, not a face, but a feeling. Reckless, brave, kind. It was uncomfortable. Ezra should have left him behind, but he didn't. And that made all the difference. For the first time in a long time, someone had looked at Hondo and seen more than a relic. Ezra had seen use in him, value that didn't rely on intimidation or memory. And that fragile thread of belief was something Hondo hadn't felt in years. They didn't become allies overnight. Hondo still schemed, still lied, still placed profits above promises. But with Ezra, the lies were softer, the risks were lower. There was restraint, the kind of restraint that doesn't come from fear, but from care. Hondo didn't understand it. He didn't like it, but he didn't run from it either. Ezra had something Hondo never did: purpose. And slowly, piece by piece, that purpose became a gravity Hondo couldn't escape. He started showing up when he didn't have to, offering help when there was no deal to be made. Not often, not consistently, but enough to notice. When he helped the Ghost crew free Wookiees from slavers, it wasn't out of kindness. Not at first. But when he saw the prisoners, shackled, starving, afraid, something shifted. Hondo, the former slaver, hesitated. And in that moment, he chose differently. He turned his ship not toward profit, but toward rescue. No one thanked him. Ezra didn't even smile. He just nodded, like he expected Hondo to do the right thing. And somehow, that hurt more than anger ever could. He began to see the rebellion not as heroes, but as survivors. People like him, living on the edge, fighting against something too large to destroy, but still fighting. Hondo mocked them, called them fools, said they were doomed. But he kept returning. For jobs, yes, but also for something he couldn't name. Maybe it was the way they looked at each other, like a crew, like a family. Maybe it reminded him of what he lost. Or maybe it reminded him of what he could still be. When Ezra asked him for help during the mission to infiltrate the Imperial outpost, Hondo could have declined. It was dangerous. No payout. No leverage. But Ezra didn't plead. He didn't flatter. He just asked. And Hondo said yes. That yes cost him a ship, cost him weapons, cost him time, but it gave him something else, a memory he didn't regret. After the mission, Ezra offered him a place, not on the crew, not officially, just a seat, a shared drink, a conversation not driven by credits. And Hondo almost cried. He didn't. He made a joke instead, mocked the drink, rolled his eyes. But inside, something old cracked open. Ezra had trusted him, not blindly, not foolishly, but honestly. And for Hondo Ohnaka, that trust was worth more than any treasure. Because for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel like a pirate. He felt like a person. Most men spend their lives chasing something: power, belonging, survival. Hondo Ohnaka had chased them all, and yet the one thing he never chased was legacy, but it found him anyway. By the time the Empire fell and whispers of a new republic reached the Outer Rim, Hondo was no longer a name spoken with caution. He was a tale told in passing, a rumor passed in back alleys or aboard spice freighters, the pirate who once held Jedi hostage, the outlaw who danced with death and profit, the man who outlived his enemies and allies alike, not by strength, not by loyalty, but by knowing when to vanish. He was old now, older than most would guess. The years had not been kind, nor had they been cruel. They had simply passed. And yet, despite all odds, he remained. He was no longer the Hondo who stood atop towers on Florum, laughing as Republic ships filled the sky. He was not the man who once sat across from Count Dooku, pretending to be ignorant while planning his next betrayal. Those days were memories wrapped in silence, fragments he didn't speak of anymore, but someone else remembered. His path crossed with them, young rebels, fighters of the new cause. They called themselves the Resistance, and they carried with them a fire he hadn't seen since the Clone Wars. Most saw Hondo as useless, a relic, a smuggler with a mouth too big for his own good. But not all of them. Some saw the way he understood people, how he could talk his way out of anything, how he knew the cracks in every system, the greed in every general, the price of every secret. And they needed that. Ezra had seen it first. Even after the boy vanished, others still remembered Hondo's role, not as a leader, not as a warrior, but as the one who got things done when no one else could. Quietly, dirty, efficient. He didn't attend meetings. He didn't wear insignias. He didn't march in parades or lead charges, but cargo arrived where it needed to. Intel slipped through the cracks. Distractions erupted in places that gave rebels just enough time to disappear. He did it not for glory, not even for the credits, though he never turned them down. He did it because someone had once believed in him, and he couldn't forget that. Hondo Ohnaka had never been anyone's hero, but he had helped heroes when it mattered most. In time, his name began to surface again, not on bounty boards, but in stories, in myths told by pilots who swore a Weequay had saved them in the void of space, in tales passed between droids about a smuggler who tricked an entire Star Destroyer into abandoning a system, in rebel archives buried under layers of classified reports. There were missions tagged with 3 simple words: assistance from Ohnaka. He should have faded. He should have died nameless on some backwater moon, forgotten like so many others. But instead, he became something more dangerous than forgotten. He became remembered, not as the most powerful, not as the most feared, but as the one who survived everything. And in the end, that mattered more. Because in a galaxy where even Jedi fell, where empires rose and vanished, where names like Skywalker and Kenobi echoed in the stars, there was still a place for a pirate, not on thrones, not in temples, but in stories. And as long as stories were told, Hondo Ohnaka would never be gone. He had outlived his own myth, and somehow he had earned it. He stayed long after the noise faded, after the Empire fell, after the Jedi were gone, after the flags changed again and again. Hondo Ohnaka remained, not in the spotlight, not on the front lines, not where the great names carved themselves into the stone of history. No, Hondo stayed in the places no one remembered, in the corridors between worlds, in the forgotten ports, in the pauses between wars. Some would say he had nothing left, but that wasn't how Hondo saw it. The truth is, he never really wanted everything. He only ever wanted enough. Enough to laugh. Enough to eat. Enough to survive the day and make it to the next with a story worth telling. And somehow, that was more than most beings in the galaxy ever managed. The First Order didn't bother with him. The Resistance didn't need him. Smugglers still crossed his path, but they no longer looked to him for leadership. The Pirate King had become a shadow of a joke, someone people remembered only when they wanted to feel better about their own failures. And Hondo? He laughed, because he knew something they didn't. He knew how to endure. On Batuu, where wild space met imperial fragments, he set up shop. It wasn't a fortress. It wasn't even a hideout. Just a small corner of the galaxy that still had room for someone like him. He didn't need an empire anymore. He only needed the illusion of one. A hangar, a crew of droids, and a few fresh recruits, most of whom didn't know the name Ohnaka until he shouted it himself. And still, in every lie he told, there was a bit of truth. In every fake mission, every staged theft, every twisted tale. There were real scars behind the mask. His life had been built on deception, but the pain was always real. He would walk through the Black Spire outpost like he owned it, loud, boisterous, pointing at banners that once meant something, telling anyone who'd listened that he had been a legend, and daring them to say otherwise. Most thought it was a performance, but the older ones, the few who still remembered the Clone Wars, or the Jedi, or the boy from Lothal, they saw something else. They saw a man who had nothing to prove, and yet kept proving it anyway. Because if he didn't, he might disappear completely. And Hondo was never afraid of death, only of being forgotten. He spent his days arranging transport runs, telling half-true stories to wide-eyed travelers, laughing too loud, too often, acting as if he still had control. But in the quiet moments, between the missions, after the crowds left when the stars were clear and no one called his name, something in him sank. Not regret, never that, but a strange emptiness. He had outlived the Jedi, the Sith, the Republic, the Separatists, the Empire, and the Rebellion. He had survived every shift in the tide, but with each passing era, he lost a piece of the galaxy that made him who he was. There were no more castles to storm, no more convoys to raid, no more naive fools to kidnap and ransom. There was only the performance. But even that had meaning. In his own way, Hondo became something more than a pirate, more than a war relic. He became a reminder, a living story, a joke that outlasted the seriousness of the galaxy. And in a time when seriousness only brought suffering, the joke mattered. He never told anyone where he came from. Not really. He never said where the others went, or how many times he'd come close to dying. He never told them how much he missed the ones who never came back. He just smiled and moved forward. Because that's what pirates do. They don't mourn. They remember. And Hondo remembered everything. There were days he thought about Ezra, about Kanan, about Asajj, strangely, and about the clones, the Jedi, the generals, the ones who trusted him when they shouldn't have, and the ones who didn't, who were usually right. He remembered the sound of blaster fire in the canyons of Florum, the smell of the sea air before a raid, the feeling of holding something valuable, even if it was just hope. He remembered what it felt like to be feared. Now, people smiled at him, took holos, called him colorful. But Hondo wasn't bitter, because even now, in the quietest corner of the galaxy, he was still alive, and he still had one thing that mattered: his story. The world kept spinning, but his name stopped echoing in it. There was no grand betrayal, no explosive standoff in a moonlit alley, just silence. One by one, the old voices disappeared. The bickering, the laughter, the tension of last-second escapes, all replaced by empty corridors and forgotten frequencies. For the first time in decades, Hondo Ohnaka had no crew to command, no enemies to deceive, no plan to set in motion. He walked alone now, not because he chose solitude, but because time had stolen everything else. The crimson dawn had come and gone. Black sun was swallowed by its own shadows. Jabba was long dead, and the Hutts no longer ruled with the same certainty. Even the Empire, once towering and absolute, had collapsed into ash. But Hondo, somehow, he remained, not in power, not in fear, just in presence. He lingered like a half-remembered song, familiar to some, meaningless to most. On Batuu, among the crumbling stones of Black Spire Outpost, Hondo found a kind of exile that didn't feel like punishment. The old spaceport was barely alive. Smugglers passed through in short bursts of noise, and first-order patrols brought brief flickers of control. But in the quiet hours, the only hours that mattered anymore, there was just dust and wind and memory. He turned a hangar into a base. Not an empire, not even a crew, just a place with walls that didn't betray him. Ships came and went, sometimes piloted by those too desperate to ask who he was, sometimes by those who remembered. A few would call him legend. Most just called him old man. He didn't correct them. There was no need to explain the stories etched behind his eyes. The galaxy no longer cared for pirates or poets. It wanted soldiers, leaders, heroes. Hondo had never been any of those things, but he had survived. Survived the Clone Wars, survived Dooku's wrath, survived Maul's chaos, the Empire's iron grip, and even the rebellion's recklessness. He had outlived men with greater armies and darker ambitions, and that, perhaps, was its own kind of power. Still, survival is a poor companion. The quiet nights became longer. He would talk to no one, then laugh like someone had answered. He'd sip spice-infused tea that tasted like memories. He'd fix old droids not for function, but because they reminded him of others, of pilots and friends and enemies, all vanished into the dust. There was a protocol droid once, missing half its plating, who stayed by his side for a few cycles. Hondo gave it a name it didn't need and taught it to cheat at Sabak. One night, the droid simply shut down. Not damaged. Just done. Hondo didn't repair it. He left it there, sitting upright at the table, cards still frozen in its hand. Visitors came rarely now. Occasionally, a young scavenger would show up, wide-eyed and reckless, chasing stories they barely believed. Hondo would watch them quietly from the shadows. Sometimes he'd speak, sometimes not. He never tried to impress them. He didn't need to. They came chasing echoes. And that's all he had left to give. Some days he told stories. Not all were true. Not all were false. But each one was told slowly, like it mattered. He spoke of Jedi who had lost everything and still smiled. Of clones who didn't know how to live once the war ended. Of Wookiees who owed him their lives. Of Trando-Shans who wanted his head but respected his code. And always of treasure, even when none was left. The younger ones would laugh, thinking him delusional. But the older smugglers, the ones with burn marks behind their eyes, they listened, because they knew they had been there too. Maybe not with him, but in the same story, the same collapse. Hondo never asked for credits. He asked for company, for silence that didn't feel like a punishment. But even that was rare. More often, the stars would turn overhead, and he would sit by the empty table, pretending it was still full. He'd toast to ghosts and make plans with people who were long dead. He wasn't losing his mind. Not yet. He just didn't want to let go. Because if he let go, who else would remember? His legacy wasn't written in monuments. It was scattered in fragments, old cargo crates, burnt transmission logs, distant worlds where someone still whispered his name in surprise. Hondo? That old pirate? Yes, that old pirate. And in every quiet corridor, every backroom cantina, his story lingered. Not as a warning, not even as a legend. Just as a man who refused to vanish, even when everything else did. There were places Hondo Ohnaka could no longer visit. Systems that once paid him tribute now paid him no mind. He had become a face too old for bounty boards, and too loud for whispers. Even the stars, it seemed, had grown quieter around him. He wandered not as a pirate anymore, not even as a smuggler. He wandered as something the galaxy had no word for, not a shadow, not a ghost, something else, something lost, but still moving. His coat grew worn, his laugh softer, his stories longer. In the cantinas of worlds too forgotten for maps, he traded memories like credits. He spoke of clone wars and Jedi, of droids with souls and Wookiees with tempers. He exaggerated, embellished, but beneath every word was truth, not because the facts mattered anymore, but because the feeling did. He didn't need anyone to believe him. He just needed them to listen. There was an old Rhodian boy on the mining moon of Gavos. Didn't know his father. Didn't speak basic well. But every time Hondo sat by the firelight and told of the time he outwitted both Count Dooku and General Grievous, the boy laughed. Not because the story was funny, but because it gave him something larger than the dust around him. That became Hondo's quiet purpose. Not credits, not ships, not survival. Just moments. A laugh, a breath held in suspense, a pause before the punchline. He once chased glory with fleets. Now he chased it with words. And yet, behind the grin, he knew. He knew none of it lasted. One night, on Ord Mantell, someone recognized him. An ex-Imperial officer, older now, meaner with time, called Hondo a traitor. Said he should have been arrested years ago. The cantina went silent. Every eye turned. Hondo didn't draw a blaster. He didn't offer a retort. He simply smiled, raised his empty glass, and said, "Then you should have arrested me years ago." The officer didn't laugh, but the others did. Not because they agreed, but because they saw something the officer didn't. They saw a man who had lost everything and still carried himself like a king. But even kings grow tired. In the following cycles, Hondo spoke less. He sat at the edge of campfires, listening instead of performing. He watched children argue over who shot first, Han or Greedo, and smiled. He'd met them both. Didn't matter. What mattered was the firelight on their faces, the way they still believed in heroes, the way they still thought stories could shape the stars. He never told them how close the galaxy had come to losing its soul. He never told them about the Jedi temple burning, or the way the Force itself seemed to scream in silence. Some stories weren't meant to be shared. Some stories were meant to stay buried in the chest of old men who had lived too long. Still, Hondo found his way to Batu, not because it mattered, but because it didn't. There, in the shadows of Black Spire Outpost, he found refuge not in walls, but in echoes. Smugglers who didn't ask questions. Droids that didn't care. A cantina that remembered him only as a good tipper. He wasn't feared. He wasn't hunted. He was just known. One day, a traveler approached him, young, wide-eyed, hopeful. Said he'd heard the name Ohnaka whispered in a spice den on Nar Shaddaa. Said he wanted to know how to become a pirate, a real one. Hondo looked at the boy for a long time, not with pride, not with warning, just with weight. Then he said, "A real pirate does not ask how. He simply becomes." The boy didn't understand, but he nodded as if he did, and Hondo knew that was enough. He gave him an old compass. It didn't work anymore. Or maybe it did. Didn't matter. The point wasn't direction. The point was movement. That night, Hondo didn't tell any stories. He sat alone on a crate near the edge of the outpost, watching the stars. Somewhere, above him, war raged. Empires fell. Republics rose. Jedi returned. Sith hid. And he watched. Not with regret, not with longing, but with memory. The galaxy didn't need him anymore, but he had once meant something to it. And in some corners, perhaps he still did. He whispered to no one, "I am still here." The stars did not answer, but they listened. There was no funeral, no final broadcast, no grand exit. The last time anyone saw Hondo Ohnaka, It wasn't on the battlefield. It wasn't in a prison cell or in the throne room of some lost syndicate. It was behind a quiet bar on Batu, trading a broken fuel cell for a cup of warm ale. No one recognized him, or maybe they did, and chose to forget. Hondo didn't age like a legend. He aged like a man, slower, weaker, lonelier. His robes, once lined with gold, were now patched with cloth from 5 systems. His voice still carried charm, but not volume. The words still danced, but no one danced with them. What remained was a body moved by habit, and a heart moved by memory. Some said he died on that moon. Others swore he just walked into the unknown regions, chasing one last myth. But the truth is harder than rumor. The truth is, he faded. The Falcon didn't come for him. The Jedi didn't visit. There were no droids to hold his hand, no pirates to raise a glass. The man who once controlled hyperlanes, crashed Republic convoys, and laughed in the face of Sith simply stopped showing up. It wasn't all at once. For a while, he was still around. The old shopkeeper in Black Spire still found a blaster missing after Hondo passed through. A few crates of coaxium went missing. At the same time, a familiar ship left orbit. But eventually, even those stories stopped. One day, his name stopped appearing in cantina tales. The bounty boards went blank. No sightings, no flags, just silence. But silence isn't forgetting. A young slicer once carved his name into the wall of a run-down data hub. Hondo was here, misspelled, scratched into rust, and mostly ignored. But someone saw it. Someone asked who Hondo was, and someone else smiled. There are tales that drift across hyperspace like vapor trails, faint but real. Whispers in the outer rim speak of a Weequay who gave food to refugees with no name attached, of a masked figure who saved a child from slavers, then vanished before thanks could be given. The stories don't match, the timelines blur, but they always carry the same rhythm. Not heroic, not tragic, just true. He didn't need statues. He didn't need parades. Hondo's legacy was never built for that. It lived in the strange codes embedded in smuggler channels, in the silent nod between captains passing each other in deep space, in the cargo left behind when a desperate crew found themselves starving, and an anonymous donor had been there first. He taught no students. He built no temples. But Hondo gave something far rarer than power. He gave memory. When the New Republic tried to rebuild order, someone suggested naming a small orbital port after him. The motion was denied. Too chaotic, too unpredictable. But the pilots still called it Ohnaka's turn, unofficial, undocumented, unforgotten. The galaxy didn't need to write his ending because it wasn't an ending. Hondo Ohnaka simply disappeared. No wreckage. No grave. He became what all pirates eventually become when they live too long. Part of the mist. But sometimes, when a green light blinks wrong on a freighter, when a deal turns lucky for no reason, when a young pilot repeats a line he doesn't know he's quoting, something moves in the shadows. And for a second, it feels like someone is watching, smiling, approving, not because he was still alive, but because memory is, and memory doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need a crown or a throne. Sometimes, it just needs a story. And Hondo Ohnaka left the galaxy with more stories than any warlord, Jedi, or emperor. He didn't die a legend. He just lived long enough to become one.